Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back through centuries of dust and shadow to a time when simply being a woman meant navigating an invisible maze of rules that could ruin your life with a single misstep. You're standing in a medieval town square, the morning sun casting long shadows across cobblestones worn smooth by countless feet, and you can feel the weight of 100 watchful eyes tracking your every movement. Every gesture, every breath you dare to take in public space. The air smells of fresh bread and horse dung, of wood smoke and something indefinable. Perhaps it's fear. Perhaps it's the collective anxiety of women who know that one wrong word could brand them for life. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your grandmother always told you to keep your voice down in public, or why certain gestures still feel forbidden even in our modern world. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're tucked under blankets in Boston or listening to rain against your window in Birmingham. Maybe share what draws you to these quiet explorations of history's forgotten corners. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're a woman in the 13th century London, and you've just made a terrible mistake. You've raised your voice in the marketplace to argue with a merchant who's short-changed you 3 farthings, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. But it's your 3 farthings and you've worked hard for them. The merchant's face reddens, not with shame but with indignation, and suddenly you realise that every person within hearing distance has stopped their business to stare at you. Not at him, at you. A woman who dared to speak loudly enough to be heard over the general din of commerce and daily life has committed something worse than simple rudeness. She's transgressed against the natural order itself. The medieval world operated on the principle that women's voices were meant to be contained, controlled, rationed like precious resources that might spoil if exposed to too much air. Church fathers had spent centuries building theological arguments around the idea that Eve's voice had brought sin into the world, that feminine speech was inherently dangerous, a kind of sonic witchcraft that could lead men astray and upset the divine hierarchy. You can feel this weight now, this accumulated centuries of suspicion, pressing down on your throat like invisible hands. In the home, a woman might speak freely, or at least more freely, to her children, her servants if she had any, perhaps even to her husband if he was in a tolerant mood. But the moment she stepped through her door into the public sphere, her voice was supposed to shrink, to become small and apologetic, to seek permission before forming words. Town criers were always men. Preachers were always men. Merchants hawking their wares in loud, confident voices. Men, every single one. A woman who needed to sell goods at market was expected to do so quietly, almost shamefully, as if commerce itself was an unfortunate necessity rather than an honourable trade. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were more about control or about genuine medieval beliefs in female moral weakness. But the practical effect was the same. Silence became a woman's most valued accessory, more important than any jewellery or fine cloth. You watch as a wealthy merchant's wife passes through the square, her eyes downcast, her lips pressed together in a thin line even though you can see she's noticed the same short-changing merchant cheating another customer. She knows better than to speak. She's learned. The legal codes of medieval Europe rarely spelled out women shall not speak in public in so many words. That would be too obvious, too easy to point at and protest. Instead, The rules worked through reputation, through social consequence, through the understanding that a loud woman was a loose woman, that volume correlated directly with virtue's absence. In some German towns, women who spoke too boldly in public could be fitted with a scold's bridle, a metal cage that locked around the head with a piece that pressed down on the tongue. The humiliation wasn't just in wearing it, it was in being paraded through the street so everyone could see what happened to women who forgot their place. You think about the women you know who've mastered the art of public silence. Your neighbour Agnes, who discovered her husband was selling their grain reserves without telling her, ruining their chances of making it through winter. She confronted him at home, never where others might hear. Your sister Margaret, who once witnessed a crime in the town square but gave her testimony to the magistrate in whispers, apologising repeatedly for having information at all. Even the abbess at the local convent, a woman of considerable power and learning, lowers her voice when speaking to male church officials, as if volume itself might threaten her authority. Here's something that might make you smile, or maybe grimace. Medieval women developed an entire vocabulary of significant looks, subtle gestures, and careful positioning to communicate what they couldn't say aloud. A certain tilt of the head at market might mean that merchant is honest. A particular way of holding a basket could signal, stay away from that stall. They created a silent language born of necessity, and some scholars believe this contributed to women's reputation for being mysterious or impossible to understand. Men had forgotten that they'd forced women to speak in code. The irony thickens when you consider that the same society that demanded women's public silence also blamed them for being deceptive, for hiding their true thoughts, for being untrustworthy. It's rather like tying someone's hands behind their back and then criticising their inability to applaud. Medieval logic at its finest. Women were caught in an impossible bind. Speak up and be branded as immodest shrews. Stay silent and be labelled as scheming manipulators who couldn't be trusted because who knew what they were really thinking? The few women who managed to have public voices did so through carefully constructed loopholes. Queens could speak because they were essentially honorary men, their royal blood temporarily overriding their female bodies. Prophets and mystics could speak because they claimed to be mere vessels for God's voice, not their own words at all. You understand. Just divine dictation. Saint Catherine of Siena wrote letters to popes and kings, but always framed her bold political advice as humble messages from heaven. Joan of Arc heard voices that gave her permission to command armies, until those same voices were reinterpreted as demonic, and she burned for listening to them. You finish your transaction with the cheating merchant, accepting your short change because what choice do you have? Your voice has already drawn too much attention. An older woman passing by gives you a look, not unkind, but knowing. She's lived longer in this world of measured words and swallowed protests. Tonight, at home, you'll tell your husband about the merchant's dishonesty, and maybe he'll care enough to avoid that stall in the future. Or maybe he'll tell you that 3 farthings isn't worth making a fuss over, that you should have kept your mouth shut in the first place. Either way, you've learned your lesson. The marketplace isn't a place for your voice, no matter how justified your complaint. The medieval world has rules, and you've just been reminded of one of the most fundamental. Your words are dangerous. Your volume is threatening. Your voice itself is something to be rationed and controlled. Tomorrow you'll speak more quietly. You'll have to... You stand before your wardrobe chest this morning, though calling it a wardrobe feels generous when it contains perhaps 3 garments total, and you're making a decision that could quite literally determine whether you're arrested before noon. The brown wool kirtle or the one with the thin stripe of madder red dye along the hem. It sounds like a simple choice, the kind of mundane decision that shouldn't matter to anyone but you, yet in the medieval world, your clothing speaks a language more fluent and more dangerous than anything that might come from your mouth. Every thread, every shade, every finger width of fabric tells a story about who you are, who you're pretending to be, and whether you're breaking laws you might not even know exist. Sumptuary laws. The word itself sounds oppressive, doesn't it? Like summer and presumptuous had a particularly authoritarian baby, were regulations that dictated exactly what each class of person could wear. They appeared across medieval Europe like a rash, breaking out in England, France, Italy, and the German states. Each government apparently convinced that society would collapse if a merchant's daughter wore the same shade of blue as a duchess. These weren't suggestions or etiquette guides, they were actual laws with actual penalties. And women bore the brunt of enforcement because female appearance was considered a more urgent matter than male dress. A man in the wrong fabric might be eccentric. A woman in the wrong colour was a threat to civilization itself. You run your fingers over the red stripe on your kirtle's hem, remembering when your aunt gave you the dress 3 years ago. She'd been a lady's maid to a minor noblewoman, and when her mistress died, she'd been given this kirtle as part of her payment. Servants often received their employer's cast-off clothing instead of coin. But here's the problem: the red dye, made from the madder root, is expensive, and in some jurisdictions, scarlet and crimson shades are reserved for nobility and the very wealthy. Your aunt assured you this particular red is faded enough, dull enough, to pass as something a common woman might afford. But you've noticed the way certain people look at you when you wear it, their eyes narrowing as they calculate your station and find the numbers don't quite add up. In 14th century Florence, the sumptuary laws ran to pages upon pages of detail. Women of the merchant class couldn't wear ermine or vair, a type of squirrel fur arranged in pretty patterns that lined the cloaks of the nobility. They couldn't wear certain shades of purple, which required dye from Mediterranean mollusks and cost more than most families earned in a year. They couldn't have more than 2 rings, couldn't wear pearl buttons, couldn't trim their sleeves with silver thread. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily about maintaining class distinctions or about economic protectionism, keeping wealthy merchants from spending their money on luxury imports instead of investing in local industry. But for you, standing in your bedroom, the motivation hardly matters. The effect is the same. The fabric itself tells tales. Silk whispers of distant trade routes and disposable income. Velvet announces that you have both money and connections, because velvet weaving was a closely guarded art practiced in only a few Italian cities. Even the weight and weave of wool communicated your status, fine. Soft wool from English downs for the wealthy, coarse, scratchy wool from local sheep for everyone else. You wear the coarse wool, and it itches against your skin like a constant reminder of your place in the world's hierarchy. Sometimes you dream about silk, about how it must feel to wear something that doesn't chafe, that doesn't leave your skin red and irritated by day's end. But silk is forbidden to you by law and by poverty in equal measure, a double lock on a door you were never meant to open. Here's something that might make you laugh. The laws were so specific, so absurdly detailed, that they included regulations about button quantity. Yes, buttons. In some French territories, common women were limited in how many buttons they could have on a single garment, usually around 12, while noble women could button themselves up with abandon. The theory was that buttons, especially decorative ones, were a form of jewellery, and jewellery was meant to be rationed according to rank. Never mind that buttons actually serve a functional purpose. Medieval lawmakers had decided they were primarily ornamental, and therefore subject to regulation. You wonder if anyone ever counted the buttons on your dress, and what would happen if you had 13 instead of 12? Would they arrest you? Fine you? Make you remove the offending button right there in the street? Colours carried meanings that went beyond mere aesthetics. Green was associated with youth and sometimes with loose morals. There's a reason so many medieval illustrations of prostitutes show them in green gowns. Yellow could mark you as Jewish in some regions, as part of the discriminatory laws that forced religious minorities to identify themselves through clothing. White was for virgins and for mourning, though which was which depended on where you lived. Confusing, dangerous, a way to transgress without even knowing you'd done so. Blue was the colour of the Virgin Mary and therefore somewhat protected, considered modest and appropriate for respectable women, which is why you see so many medieval paintings of middle-class women in various shades of blue. It was the safest choice, the least likely to get you in trouble. The penalties for breaking sumptuary laws varied, but they all hurt. Fines you couldn't afford, confiscation of the offending garment, which might be your only good dress, public humiliation, sometimes even imprisonment for repeat offenders. In some Italian cities, there were actual fashion police, officials whose entire job was to patrol the streets looking for women in illegal fabrics or forbidden trims. They had the authority to stop you, to examine your clothing, to literally measure the length of your train or the width of your sleeves. Imagine being late for market because a government inspector decided to check whether your hem was legally compliant. Or women of wealth developed elaborate strategies to circumvent these laws while technically obeying them. They'd wear simple outer garments made of legal fabrics, but underneath, hidden from casual inspection, they'd have chemises of silk or underdresses with forbidden embroidery. They'd put all their expensive decoration on removable sleeves that could be swapped out depending on who might be watching. They'd argue about definitions. Is this purple or is it merely dark blue? Is this fur from a forbidden animal or from a similar but technically legal creature? The courts filled with cases of women prosecuting other women for wearing fabrics above their station, and historians still debate whether this was genuine moral outrage or simply strategic warfare between rival families using clothing laws as weapons. You choose the brown kirtle today, the safe one, the one that won't draw any glances or questions. The red trim dress goes back into the chest, maybe next Sunday, when you're only going to church and back, where the familiar faces know your family and won't report you. Maybe. The weight of these decisions presses on your shoulders as you dress. Every morning a calculation of risk versus desire, safety versus the simple human wish to wear something beautiful. Your neighbour's daughter was fined last month for wearing a silk ribbon in her hair, just a finger width of fabric that her sweetheart had given her. The fine was more than her father earned in a week. The ribbon was confiscated, of course, but the real punishment was the shame, the way people talked about her afterward, suggesting that a girl who'd wear illegal silk in her hair was probably morally compromised in other ways too. The medieval world wrapped women in regulations as tightly as it wrapped them in wool, and both constrained movement. Both reminded you with every moment that your body was not entirely your own, that your choices were not entirely yours to make. Tomorrow you'll wake and make the same calculations again, weighing fabrics against consequences, colours against laws, beauty against survival, and you'll probably choose brown again, safe brown, legal brown, because the alternative is too risky and life is already hard enough without adding fashion crimes to your list of daily concerns. The sun is setting earlier these days, autumn creeping into the edges of evening, and you're still 3 streets away from home. You can feel panic rising in your chest like cold water, because you know what happens to women who are caught outside after dark without a male escort, without a lantern, without a good reason that some man in authority deems acceptable. The shadows are lengthening across the narrow street. pooling in doorways and alleys, and you walk faster, your wooden patterns clattering against the cobblestones in a rhythm that sounds like hurry and hurry, hurry. Every woman knows this fear, this race against the dying light, because nighttime transforms even the most respectable female into something suspect, something dangerous, something that doesn't belong in public space. During daylight hours, the streets belong to everyone, merchants and beggars, nobles and servants, men and women all mixed together in the chaotic dance of medieval urban life. But when the sun drops below the horizon, the rules change with a finality as absolute as the darkness itself. Night belongs to men, to the watch patrols, to the tavern goers and the legitimate travellers with torches and company. Night also belongs to criminals, to cut purses and worse. And in the medieval mind, any woman walking alone after dark must be either a victim waiting to happen or a criminal herself. Usually the latter. The logic was simple and brutal. Honest women stay home after dark. Therefore, any woman you encounter outside must be dishonest. You remember the last time you miscalculated, when you stayed too late at your sister's house helping with a difficult childbirth. You'd left when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, and you'd been so tired, so relieved, that you hadn't noticed how dark it had gotten until you were halfway home. A night watchman had stopped you, his torch throwing dancing quadrilles across his suspicious face, and he'd demanded to know your business. You'd explained about the birth, about your sister, about the midwife who'd needed an extra pair of hands. But you could see in his eyes that he didn't quite believe you. Respectable women arranged for someone to escort them home, or they stayed the night. Only certain kinds of women walked the streets alone after dark, and those certain kinds could be arrested just for being outside. The English legal system had a specific term for it. Night walking. Sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? Like something from a fairy tale, but the reality was harsh and humiliating. Women caught night walking could be arrested, fined, put in the stocks, or worse, accused of prostitution whether they were selling their bodies or not. In many medieval towns, prostitution itself wasn't technically illegal, but it was highly regulated, confined to certain streets or districts, taxed and monitored. Being caught outside those designated areas after dark meant you were either a prostitute working without a license or a respectable woman behaving like one, and the punishment was roughly the same either way. Historians still argue whether these night-walking laws were primarily about controlling female sexuality or about genuine concerns over public safety. But you suspect the answer is both. Tangled together like thread that's been in a basket too long, impossible to separate into individual strands. The medieval world genuinely was dangerous after dark. No street lighting beyond the occasional lantern hanging outside a tavern. Narrow alleys perfect for ambush. Open sewers easy to stumble into. But the solution to this danger wasn't to make the streets safer for women. It was to forbid women from using them at all. You pass a tavern and hear male laughter spilling out into the street, along with the smell of ale and roasted meat. Men can enter these spaces freely, can stay until late, can walk home drunk and stumbling without anyone questioning their virtue or their intentions. A woman entering a tavern alone after dark might as well announce herself as a prostitute. The two were considered synonymous in most medieval minds. Even high-born ladies travelled with entourages after sunset, with torchbearers and armed guards, not just for protection, but as visible proof of their respectability. A lady alone was no lady at all. The darkness brings other dangers too, ones that the laws acknowledge only indirectly. A woman attacked on the street after dark will find it nearly impossible to get justice. Because the first question will always be, what were you doing outside? The assault itself becomes almost secondary to the crime of being there in the first place. It's a perfect trap, a double bind that medieval women wrote with increasing desperation. Stay home and remain safe but trapped, or risk the streets and accept that any violence you encounter will be at least partially your fault for having dared to exist in public space after sunset. Here's something that might make you grimace. In some medieval towns, curfew bells rang at sunset, and technically everyone was supposed to be off the streets, men and women alike, but the enforcement was wildly uneven. A man caught out after curfew might be questioned about his business and sent home with a warning. A woman caught out after curfew was assumed to be up to no good, and the penalties reflected that assumption. The same action, the same technical violation of the same law, but radically different consequences based solely on whether you were male or female. You can see your street now, just ahead, and relief floods through you like warm honey. You've made it. The sky still holds the faintest trace of twilight, that deep blue that comes before true darkness, and you'll be inside before the stars emerge. Your husband will probably scold you for cutting it so close, will remind you that respectable women plan better, leave earlier, don't put themselves in positions where their reputations might be questioned. He means well. You think, but his worry manifests as criticism, as if being afraid for you and being angry at you are the same emotion. Inside your house, you light a candle and begin preparing the evening meal, and through your small window, you can see the street transforming. The few remaining women scurry home like mice before a storm. The men emerge, heading to taverns or to visit friends, carrying lanterns that bob like fireflies in the gathering dark. The night shift begins, and it's entirely male. Watchmen, tavern keepers, the occasional merchant travelling late with guards and torches. The world outside your window becomes a place where you don't exist. Can't exist. A geography that excludes your body by law and custom and the general agreement that darkness and femininity don't mix. You think about the women who have no choice but to break this rule, the prostitutes, obviously, but also the midwives called to attend births that don't respect curfew, the servants sent on late errands by demanding employers, the poor women who work until dark and then must somehow get home through hostile streets. They navigate the night with strategies born of necessity, travelling in groups when possible, memorising which watchmen are sympathetic and which are looking for easy arrests, carrying proof of employment or the letters from employers that sometimes help and sometimes don't. There's a woman in your parish, elderly now, who tells stories about her youth in a different town, a place where the night-walking laws were enforced with particular zealousness. She was arrested 3 times before she turned 20, once leaving a sick friend's house, once walking home from church after an evening service that ran late, once for reasons she still doesn't fully understand, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong gender. Each arrest brought fines her family could barely afford, public shame that clung to her reputation like smoke to cloth, and a permanent mark against her character that followed her for years. She eventually married a man from a different town, fleeing to a place where her night-walking arrests weren't common knowledge, starting over with a reputation that hadn't been destroyed by darkness and bad timing. Tomorrow the sun will rise and the streets will belong to everyone again, at least in theory, at least during daylight hours. But tonight, you're grateful for walls and doors and windows that shut out the darkness and the dangers that come with it. You're grateful to be inside, to be self, to have made it home before the transformation was complete, and you make a mental note as you do almost every evening, to plan better tomorrow, to leave earlier, to never again cut it this close. The medieval night is not yours to claim, and forgetting that fact, even for a moment, even with the best of reasons, can cost you everything. You're 14 years old, sitting in the hall of your father's house, and two men you've never met before are discussing your future as if you're a prize mare being evaluated for breeding potential. One is elderly, perhaps 50, ancient by the medieval standards, with thin grey hair and hands spotted with age. The other is his son, closer to 30, with a florid face and breath that smells of onions even from across the room. Your father is nodding, pleased with whatever terms they're negotiating, and your mother sits in the corner with her embroidery. Her face carefully blank in that way you've learned means she's screaming internally, but knows better than to let it show. Nobody has asked you what you think. Nobody will ask you what you think. The word no exists in your vocabulary, but not in your options. Marriage in the medieval world is a property transaction dressed up with religious ceremony and romantic poetry that nobody really expects you to believe. You are the property being transacted, passed from your father's household to your husband's, your value calculated in terms of dowry and potential heirs and strategic family alliances. Love, if it comes at all, is expected to develop after the wedding. A pleasant bonus, but hardly a requirement. Your consent is theoretically necessary. The Church insists on it, has made official proclamations about how marriage must be entered into freely by both parties, but theory and practice occupy different countries in the medieval landscape, and the distance between them is vast enough to swallow any protest you might dare to make. The Church's position on marriage consent is actually quite progressive for its time, almost startlingly modern in its insistence that both parties must agree. Canon law requires that you speak the words, that you say "I will," or its equivalent, that you participate actively in the ceremony rather than being married off like a parcel delivered to the wrong address. But the Church also understands that children must obey their parents, that daughters owe obedience to their fathers, that rebellion against parental authority is a sin. So when your father tells you that you'll marry the onion-breathed son of his business partner, and when you stand at the altar and speak the required words, the Church considers this free consent, even though refusing would mean homelessness, disinheritance, social death, and quite possibly actual death by starvation or exposure. Historians still argue whether medieval women had more or less agency in marriage choices than women in later periods, but you find this debate somewhat academic when you're the one being told to pack your belongings because you're moving to a stranger's house next month. Some women, particularly widows and noblewomen, did exercise considerable control over their marriage choices, or at least their remarriage choices. A widow with property, and no male relatives to dominate her, could sometimes refuse suitors, pay fines to her lord for the privilege of remaining unmarried, negotiate her own terms. But you're not a widow, you're a girl, and the difference is everything. Your father calls you over to meet your future husband properly, and you curtsy as you've been taught, keeping your eyes downcast in the modest demeanour expected of unmarried girls. The young man, his name is Thomas, you learn, though you'll call him husband soon enough, looks you over with the frank appraisal of someone examining livestock. He asks your father about your health, your skills with needle and distaff, whether you're obedient, not whether you can read or have opinions or enjoy music. Those things don't matter. What matters is whether you'll produce healthy sons, manage his household efficiently, and not cause trouble by having thoughts above your sukkah. Here's something that might make you want to laugh or cry. You're not sure which. In some parts of medieval Europe, girls as young as 12 could be legally married. though consummation was theoretically supposed to wait until they were older, until their bodies were ready for childbearing. Theoretically. The reality was that once you were married, your husband had legal rights to your body, and whether he exercised those rights immediately or waited a few years was entirely his decision. The church frowned on consummating marriages with girls who were too young, but frowning doesn't have much enforcement power when the bedroom door closes and no witnesses remain. You think about your friend Eleanor, who tried to refuse the marriage her father arranged. She said no, clearly and repeatedly, said she'd rather join a convent, said she'd rather die. Her father locked her in her room for 2 weeks with only bread and water, visiting daily to ask if she'd reconsidered. By the end of the first week, she'd agreed to the marriage. By the end of the second week, she'd agreed to smile during the ceremony. She's married now, living 3 villages away. And when you saw her last month at the market, she looked decades older than her 17 years, pregnant with her 3rd child and moving like someone whose bones hurt. She didn't meet your eyes. The few paths around arranged marriage are narrow and treacherous. You could join a convent, but convents require dowries too, sometimes as much as a husband would cost, and your father has to agree to send you. You could run away, but where would you go? A woman alone, without family or funds, without skills beyond the domestic ones that require a household to practice them in. You'd likely end up in a brothel or dead in a ditch, and those are genuinely the 2 most probable outcomes. You could refuse at the altar, cause a scene, humiliate your father and break the contract he's made. But then you'd be returned to his house in disgrace, and you'd discover that the locked room and bread and water were just the beginning of what a furious father can inflict on a disobedient daughter. Some girls tried to create pre-contracts with men they actually wanted to marry, secret engagements that would theoretically invalidate later arrangements. The church recognized these informal marriages. Vows exchanged privately, without witnesses, were still considered binding under canon law. But proving such a marriage existed was nearly impossible without witnesses, and judges tended to side with fathers over daughters, with documented arrangements over whispered claims. The same church that insisted on consent also provided all the mechanisms for fathers to coerce it. Thomas and his father are leaving now. The negotiations apparently concluded to everyone's satisfaction except yours, which doesn't count. Your father is cheerful, already talking about the wedding feast, about which relatives to invite, about the merging of his business interests with Thomas's family concerns. Your mother catches your eye for just a moment, and you see something there. Sympathy, maybe, or recognition, or the bitter knowledge of someone who stood where you're standing now, and discovered that there was no real choice, only the illusion of choice, only the space to decide whether you'd walk into your cage quietly or be carried in screaming. You're told the wedding will be in 6 weeks, which is actually generous by medieval standards. Some girls got less warning. Woke up one morning to discover that today was their wedding day, dressed and delivered to the church before they could fully process what was happening. 6 weeks gives you time to prepare, to accumulate the household goods you'll need, to learn what you can about your future husband and his family. 6 weeks also gives you time to imagine all the ways this could go wrong, all the futures you'll never have, all the men you might have preferred if preference were a factor in any of this. Do you remember the stories you heard as a child? About princesses rescued by princes, about true love conquering all obstacles? Those stories never mentioned that princesses didn't choose their princes, that rescue meant being transferred from one male guardian to another, that love was supposed to develop on schedule after the wedding vows, whether the ingredients were there or not. The stories lied, or at least they left out all the parts that mattered. All the parts where women like you discover that their lives were predetermined by men who saw them as assets to be managed rather than humans with desires and dreams and the right to refuse. Tonight, in your bed in your father's house, soon to be your former home, though you've lived here your entire life, you stare at the ceiling and try to imagine being married to Thomas. You try to picture waking up next to him for the next 30 or 40 years, bearing his children, managing his household, obeying his commands. You try to imagine growing old together, developing the kind of partnership you've seen in some long-married couples who've learned to tolerate and even appreciate each other. Maybe it will be fine. Maybe he'll be kind. Maybe you'll be one of the lucky ones who finds that affection could grow in soil that was never chosen, never tilled with care, just assigned by fathers who saw advantages that had nothing to do with happiness. Or maybe you'll be like Eleanor, old before your time, worn down by childbearing and obedience and the slow erosion of self that comes from living a life you never wanted. Either way, 6 weeks from now you'll stand at the altar and say the words that seal your fate, and everyone will consider it your choice. Your consent, freely given, even though the only real choice was whether to walk or be dragged, and you're sitting in the chapel during Mass, trying to follow along with the Latin prayers that wash over you like water over stones. Beautiful sounds that mean nothing because nobody has ever taught you to decode them. The priest reads from an enormous book, his fingers tracing lines of mysterious script that might as well be magical incantations for all the sense you can make of them. Your neighbour's son, a boy of 10, sits near the front with the other students, following along in his primer, lips moving as he sounds out words. You're 23 years old, and you can't read your own name. This isn't an accident. This isn't neglect. This is policy. Intention, the deliberate withholding of knowledge that might make you dangerous. Literacy in the medieval world is power concentrated in very few hands, and those hands are almost exclusively male. Priests read and write Latin, the language of church and law and learning. Merchants and scribes read and write in vernacular languages, keeping accounts and drafting contracts. Nobles, male nobles, learn enough to manage their estates and correspond with other powerful men. And you learn to spin and weave, to manage a household, to recognize certain symbols that help you navigate daily life. But actual reading, the kind that unlocks books and ideas and knowledge, that's not for you. That's not for any woman unless she's very wealthy or very unusual or both, and even then it's suspect. The reasoning, when anyone bothers to explain it, goes something like this. Women's minds are naturally weaker, more prone to deception, less capable of the kind of rigorous thinking that reading requires. Eve fell to the serpent's lies, and her daughters inherited her intellectual frailty. Teach a woman to read, and you give her access to ideas that might lead her astray. Heretical texts, romantic poetry that fills her head with inappropriate notions, knowledge that makes her discontent with her proper role. Better to keep her innocent, which is just another word for ignorant, which is just another word for controllable. Historians still argue whether medieval women were truly more literate than we think, perhaps reading but not writing, perhaps literate in vernacular languages but not Latin, perhaps possessing practical literacy for household management while lacking access to scholarly learning. But these distinctions feel academic when you're standing in the marketplace trying to determine if the merchant's written receipt matches what you actually purchased, having to trust his honesty because you can't verify his numbers yourself. You know women who can read, a handful of them, and their stories all follow similar patterns. Lady Margaret at the Manor House learned as a child, because her father had no sons and needed someone to help with correspondence until a male heir arrived, which he never did. So Margaret became accidentally educated through dynastic misfortune. Sister Agnes at the convent learned because nuns need to read psalms and holy texts, though even in convents, full literacy is far from universal. And then there's strange old Beatrice who lives at the edge of town, who taught herself to read somehow, and everyone whispers that she must have made a deal with dark forces, because how else would a common woman acquire such unnatural knowledge? The danger of reading isn't just theoretical. Books themselves are suspect objects, expensive and rare, each one copied by hand over months or years of painstaking labour. A single book might cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. The books that do exist are carefully controlled religious texts in Latin that require interpretation by authorised clergy, legal documents written in arcane language that keeps the law mysterious and thus powerful, classical learning locked away in monastery libraries where women are forbidden to enter. For you to own a book would be remarkable. For you to be able to read it would be revolutionary. Here's something that might make you shake your head. In some medieval cities, there were actually laws against teaching women to read beyond the most basic level. In others, the prohibition was social rather than legal, but just as effective. Schoolmasters who accepted female students risked losing their male pupils. Parents who educated daughters were viewed as foolish at best and dangerous at first. The few schools that existed were for boys, training them for church positions or merchant work or legal professions. All careers closed to women anyway. What would be the point of teaching girls to read when they just get married and waste all that education on household management? You think about what you could do if you could read. You could keep your own accounts instead of relying on your husband's word about the household finances. You could read the Bible yourself instead of hearing it filtered through priests who might interpret it in ways that conveniently support male authority. You could read medical texts and recipe books and histories and poetry. You could write letters to your sister in the next village instead of paying a scribe and hoping he doesn't read your private words to others for entertainment. And you could verify contracts before your husband signs them, could check market weights and measures, could access the accumulated knowledge of centuries instead of being limited to what older women teach you through oral tradition. But literacy comes with costs that go beyond the practical difficulty of obtaining it. A woman who can read becomes suspect, her femininity questionable, her motives unclear. If she's reading, what else might she be doing? If she can access knowledge independently, what prevents her from accessing the wrong knowledge? The same books that contain psalms also contain heresies. The same skills that let you read a recipe could let you read revolutionary texts that question the social order. Better to keep women illiterate and thus safely contained within acceptable boundaries. The irony is that wealthy women sometimes become accidentally literate through their devotional practices. Books of hours, prayer books customized for individual owners, become fashionable among noble ladies. Beautiful objects with illuminated pages and personal prayers. A woman who spends hours each day with her prayer book might start recognizing words, might piece together the relationship between sounds and symbols, might achieve a kind of functional literacy despite never having formal instruction. The Church approves of this because the reading is purely religious, safely channeled toward devotion rather than dangerous independent thought. Or so they hope. You've started teaching yourself, in small ways, in secret. The baker marks his bread with symbols that indicate prices, and you've learned to recognize these. The tavern keeper's sign has pictures and words, and you've matched the words to the pictures enough times that you think you're actually reading rather than just memorizing. Your husband has a ledger book, and when he's away, you've opened it, tried to make sense of the columns and notations, compared entries until patterns emerged. It's frustratingly slow, this self-education, and you're never sure if you're actually understanding or just fooling yourself. But it's also thrilling in a way that's hard to explain. Each recognised word feels like a tiny rebellion, a small claim on knowledge that was never meant to be yours. The risk is real, though if your husband discovered your attempts at literacy, he'd likely be angry, not violently so, you hope, but certainly displeased. It would confirm suspicions that you have too much time on your hands, that you need more work to keep you occupied, that you're developing ideas above your station. If neighbours discovered it, the gossip would be worse. They'd wonder what you were reading, what you were learning, whether you'd used your literacy for witchcraft or heresy, or simply to deceive your husband about household accounts. Literacy makes a woman unpredictable, and unpredictable women are dangerous women in the medieval imagination. The priest finishes the Mass with prayers you still can't translate, closing his precious book with reverent hands. Around you, other women bow their heads in devotion, accepting their exclusion from the written word as natural and proper, or at least pretending to accept it, because what choice do they have? You bow your head too, but behind your closed eyes, you're reviewing the letters you've learned, the words you can now recognise, the slow accumulation of knowledge that nobody gave you permission to possess. Tomorrow you'll try again. Steal a few more moments with symbols and meanings. Build your forbidden literacy one secret word at a time. It's not much. It's probably not enough. But it's yours, this small act of intellectual disobedience, this quiet insistence that your mind deserves feeding just as much as any man's. You're at a wedding feast, surrounded by music and food and the warm press of celebrating bodies, and you've just heard the funniest story, something about the groom's brother and a goat and a misunderstanding that ended with everyone covered in mud. Laughter bubbles up in your chest, genuine and delighted, and for half a second you forget yourself and let it out. A full-throated laugh that rings across the hall like a bell. The conversation around you stops. Heads turn. Your husband's hand closes on your arm. Not painfully, but firmly. A warning transmitted through pressure and placement. You've transgressed again, committed the crime of audible joy, and the sudden silence around you feels like judgment made manifest in the absence of sound. A woman's laughter, according to medieval thinking, should be like her speech. Controlled, moderate, contained within acceptable boundaries that men have drawn with invisible ink only other women can see. A quiet chuckle behind your hand is acceptable. A demure smile that suggests amusement without confirming it is ideal. But a full laugh, the kind that comes from your belly and escapes your throat before you can catch it. The kind that throws your head back and shows your teeth. That's the laughter of a woman who's forgotten her place, who's let her guard down, who might be capable of other, worse forms of letting go. The reasoning behind this particular rule is tangled up with medieval ideas about female sexuality and self-control, or rather the assumption that women possess neither in sufficient quantities. A loud laugh suggests a woman who's lost control of herself. And if she can't control her laughter, what else can't she control? Medieval medical texts, all written by men of course, claim that women were naturally more prone to hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek for uterus, and that excessive emotion of any kind was a warning sign of deeper instability. Laughter, especially loud laughter, was just screaming that hadn't turned dark yet. Joy that might curdle into something dangerous if left unchecked. Historians still argue whether these restrictions on female laughter were more about actual beliefs in female instability, or simply another method of control, another way to make women's bodies and voices and emotions subject to male approval, but you're less interested in the academic debate and more focused on the practical reality. You've laughed too loudly at a wedding feast, and now you're the subject of disapproving glances and whispered comments. Your reputation taking tiny hits that will accumulate over time like rust on iron. You think about the women you know who've mastered the art of the controlled laugh, that peculiar skill of seeming amused without ever being genuinely merry, of performing joy without actually experiencing it. Your mother-in-law has perfected it, a soft exhalation that might be laughter, or might be simply breathing with enthusiasm, her hand always rising to cover her mouth, her eyes crinkling to show she understands something is funny, even while her body remains perfectly composed. She's tried to teach you this skill, has corrected you dozens of times when your natural laughter emerged unfiltered. "Ladies don't bray like donkeys," she said once, and the comparison stung precisely because you knew other people were thinking it even if they were too polite to say it aloud. Here's something that might make you want to laugh or cry in equal measure. Conduct books and moral treatises from the medieval period spend pages discussing proper female deportment, and laughter always features prominently in the list of things to regulate. One particularly tedious text suggests that a woman should never laugh at all if she can help it, but if she absolutely must, she should do so, quietly and briefly, with her mouth barely open, her teeth concealed, and her hand positioned to hide any unseemly display of mirth. Imagine being so afraid of female joy that you need to write instructions on how to minimize its visibility. The sexual implications of loud laughter were never far from the medieval mind. A woman who laughed loudly was assumed to be sexually available, or at least sexually forward. Because restraint in one area implied restraint in all areas, and its absence suggested a general looseness of morals. Prostitutes in medieval art and literature are often depicted laughing raucously, heads thrown back, mouths wide open, a visual shorthand that told viewers exactly what kind of woman they were seeing. Respectable women kept their laughter quiet, kept their mouths closed, kept their joy private and controlled, lest anyone mistake them for the other kind of woman, the kind whose laughter suggested other, more scandalous openness. You notice the young women at the wedding feast now, the unmarried girls sitting together, and you watch how they handle moments of levity. They giggle behind their hands, they smile with lips pressed together, they sometimes shake with suppressed laughter that never quite becomes audible. They've learned already, these girls barely old enough to marry, that their joy is something to be rationed and concealed. You wonder when exactly you learned this lesson. Was there a specific moment of correction, or did it seep into you gradually through 1,000 tiny adjustments? 1,000 reminders that you were being too much, too loud, too present in spaces that preferred you diminished? The feast continues, and you're more careful now, monitoring your own reactions like a spy in your own body. Something funny happens. The juggler drops all his balls at once and blames an invisible cat, and you feel laughter rising again. This time you catch it. Transform it into that acceptable quiet chuckle. Your hand rising automatically to cover your mouth even though barely any sound escapes. Your husband's grip on your arm relaxes. You've learned the lesson, at least for tonight. You're performing femininity correctly again. Joy contained within appropriate boundaries. Your pleasure muted to acceptable volumes. But here's the thing about suppressing laughter. It doesn't actually make you stop finding things funny. It just makes you better at hiding your reactions. Inside, you're still laughing, still delighted by the absurdity and humour of life, still experiencing the full range of joyful emotion. You've just learned to keep it invisible. to divorce your internal experience from your external presentation. In some ways, this makes you a better actor, constantly performing a more subdued version of yourself. In other ways, it makes you feel like you're slowly disappearing, like each suppressed laugh erases a little more of who you actually are. You look around the hall and wonder how many other women are doing the same thing right now, feeling one thing while showing another. Their actual emotions hidden behind careful masks of appropriate response. The men laugh loudly and freely, their voices booming across the hall, and nobody criticizes them for it. If anything, a man who laughs heartily is seen as good-natured, as someone enjoying life properly. The same behavior that marks you as loose marks him as simply happy. The same volume that suggests your sexual availability suggests his emotional health. It's remarkable, really, how the same action can mean opposite things depending on which body performs it. The evening wears on, and you maintain your careful control, your moderated responses, your acceptable level of visible joy. Later, at home, alone with your husband, you ask him why he grabbed your arm, why your laughter was so problematic. He looks at you with genuine confusion, as if the answer should be obvious. People were staring, he says. You sounded like a tavern wench. I was embarrassed for you. Not angry, not cruel. Just matter of fact in his assessment that your natural expression of joy was something shameful. Something that reflected poorly on both of you. You don't argue because what would be the point? This isn't his personal rule but a social one, enforced by everyone and therefore belonging to no one. Impossible to fight because there's no single enemy to confront. Instead, you nod, promise to be more careful, add this to your growing list of ways to make yourself smaller and quieter and more acceptable. Tomorrow you'll practice laughing correctly. We'll stand in front of your polished metal mirror and rehearse the proper facial expressions, the right hand movements, the acceptable sounds. You'll train yourself the way you might train a dog, through repetition and correction, until the performance becomes automatic and you no longer remember what it felt like to laugh freely without calculation or fear. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. Not the initial correction, not the social pressure, but the moment when you internalize it so completely that you stop noticing you're doing it. The moment when suppressing your laughter becomes as natural as the laughter itself once was. When you forget what it felt like to let joy escape uncensored. That's when they've really won. When the external control becomes internal monitoring. When you become your own jailer and don't even recognize the bars. You're standing in front of your small mirror, really just a piece of polished metal that gives back a wavering, uncertain reflection. And you're braiding your hair for the morning. Your fingers move through the familiar pattern. 3 strands weaving over and under, creating the plait you've worn since childhood. But today you pause, wondering what would happen if you left it loose. Let it flow down your back like it does at night when only your husband sees it. The thought is brief, quickly dismissed, because you already know the answer. Loose hair on a married woman in public means only one thing, signals only one message, and that message is, I'm available. Which is another way of saying your reputation would be destroyed before you made it to the market. Hair in the medieval world is never just hair. It's a communication system, a social marker, a visible announcement of your marital status and moral character that everyone can read from across the street. The rules are complex and unforgiving, varying slightly by region but consistent in their basic message. Your hair is powerful, sexual, dangerous, and must be controlled according to strict guidelines that change the moment you transition from maiden to wife. Loose hair on a virgin suggests innocence and availability for marriage. The same loose hair on a married woman suggests adultery or prostitution. The same hair. Different meaning, instant judgment. As an unmarried girl, you wore your hair long and loose, or perhaps in a single braid down your back, advertising your virginity like a flag announcing a ship's country of origin. The hair itself was considered one of your primary attractions, something men would evaluate when considering you for marriage. Long, thick hair suggested health and youth and fertility, all the things a medieval husband wanted in a wife. But the moment you married, that same hair became shameful, something to be hidden away from public view, covered completely or at least bound up so tightly that its length and beauty became theoretical rather than visible. The covering itself tells stories. Married women wear wimples, veils, kerchiefs, hoods, layers of fabric that hide not just hair but often necks and chins, and sometimes foreheads too, until only the central oval of your face remains visible. The wealthy wear elaborate silk veils with embroidered edges. The poor wear simple linen cloths tied under the chin, but everyone covers something, because uncovered hair on a married woman is grounds for accusation, suspicion, the kind of gossip that spreads like fire and burns just as destructively. Historians still argue whether hair covering was primarily religious, following biblical injunctions about women covering their heads in prayer, or social, a way to mark married women as sexually unavailable and thus less threatening to other wives. But you're less concerned with the theological debates and more focused on the practical reality. You own 4 head coverings, you wash them in rotation, and you literally cannot leave your house without one, unless you want to be mistaken for a prostitute or accused of advertising for male attention that isn't your husband's. Here's something that might make you smile grimly. The Church Fathers wrote extensively about hair, treating it with the kind of suspicious fascination usually reserved for actual sins. St. Paul said women should cover their heads because of the angels, which is mysteriously vague enough that theologians have been arguing about what he meant for centuries. Other clerical writers were more direct, calling women's hair a snare for men, a trap designed by female vanity to lead good Christian men into lustful thoughts. It's almost funny. Hair growing naturally from your head becomes evidence of malicious intent, as if you chose to have hair specifically to tempt men who apparently have no self-control whatsoever. You remember your wedding day, the ceremonial transition from girl to wife that included the symbolic covering of your hair. Your mother and aunts gathered around, braiding your hair more elaborately than usual one final time, then covering it completely with the married woman's wimple. "You're respectable now," your mother said, pinning the fabric in place, and you understood that respectable and invisible were apparently synonyms. Your husband removed the covering that night, in private, and you learned that your hair still existed, but only for him now, only in spaces where no other eyes could see. The prostitutes in your town wear their hair uncovered as a form of advertising, but also because they're legally required to in some jurisdictions, a way to mark them as sexually available, to make sure no respectable man accidentally mistakes them for respectable women. It's a perfect trap. Cover your hair and be respectable. Uncover it and be a whore, with no middle ground, no room for personal preference or comfort or the simple desire to feel the wind in your hair on a hot summer day. You think about hair as you finish your braiding and reach for your wimple. It's strange how much symbolism can be loaded onto something so ordinary. How strands of keratin growing from your scalp can become fraught with meaning about sexuality and ownership and social status. Your hair belongs to your husband now, the same way your body and your property and your future belong to him. Covering it is just making that ownership visible, announcing to the world that your claimed territory off the market, no longer available for evaluation by other men. The young girls in your neighbourhood still wear their hair loose, and you watch them sometimes with mixed feelings, envy for their freedom, pity for their innocence about what's coming. They braid flowers into their hair, let it swing when they walk, use it as the decorative element it naturally is. In a few years, each of them will go through the same transition you did. Will learn that their hair is simultaneously too powerful and too shameful to be visible, that maturity means concealment, that becoming a wife means becoming partially invisible. There are exceptions, of course, carefully prescribed moments when married women can uncover their hair without scandal, in the privacy of your home, obviously. During certain religious ceremonies where the uncovering is ritualized and therefore safe, some noble women wear elaborate headdresses that technically cover their hair while also displaying wealth and status. The covering itself becomes the ornament, jewelled and embroidered, more expensive than most women's entire wardrobes. But for common women like you, the choice is simple: cover completely or face consequences. You've heard stories about women who defied the hair rules, and none of them end well. A woman in the next village reportedly went to market with her hair uncovered, claiming the heat made her head covering unbearable. She was accused of soliciting, dragged before the local court, fined an amount that took her family months to pay. The humiliation was worse than the financial penalty. Everyone knew, everyone talked, and years later people still reference it when they want to imply something unsavoury about her character. One choice, one hot day, permanent consequences. The practical difficulties of constant hair covering are rarely discussed, but always present. The fabric gets dirty, needs constant washing, wears out and must be replaced. In summer, it's suffocatingly hot, trapping heat against your scalp until sweat runs down your neck. In winter, it's the only thing keeping your head warm, so at least there's that. The pins and ties leave marks on your skin, little indentations that you've learned to ignore. Your scalp sometimes aches from the weight and tension of the covering, from hair pulled too tight and held too long. You adjust your wimple one final time, making sure no stray hairs escape, checking that the fabric sits properly and covers everything it should. The woman looking back at you from the polished metal is respectable, proper, invisible in all the right ways. The girl with loose hair who used to run through fields feeling the wind tangle her braids is gone, or at least hidden so completely she might as well not exist. This is what they wanted, what the rules were designed to accomplish: the transformation of women into covered, controlled, carefully presented versions of themselves where even hair becomes a statement of ownership and status, rather than simply part of your body. Tomorrow you'll do this again, and the day after that, every morning for the rest of your married life unless you become a widow. And even then the rules about widow's hair are complicated and vary by region. For now, you're covered, decent, respectable, and the price of that respectability is the constant awareness that your hair, something so natural, so ordinary, has been transformed into something shameful that must be hidden from the world. Your husband died 3 weeks ago, thrown from a horse that startled at nothing visible, and you're still processing the grief when his brother arrives at your door with a sheaf of documents and a sympathetic expression that doesn't quite reach his eyes. He's come to help you manage the estate, he says, to ensure everything is handled properly during your time of mourning, and you understand immediately what's actually happening. He's come to take back the property that briefly, accidentally, became yours when your husband's heart stopped beating. You're a widow now, which in medieval terms means you occupy a strange liminal space, more legal authority than you've ever had as a wife, but only temporarily, only until the men in your life can re-establish control over the resources you temporarily hold. Widowhood is the one moment in a medieval woman's life when she might taste something resembling financial autonomy, and the taste is both intoxicating and terrifying. Your husband's property passes to you, at least in theory, at least for now. You control the workshop, the house, the savings that exist, if any exist, which in your case is a modest amount, enough to survive for perhaps a year if you're careful. You can make contracts in your own name, appear in court without a male guardian, make decisions about business matters that were completely outside your authority just a month ago when your husband was alive. For the first time in your adult life, you're not somebody's daughter or somebody's wife. You're just yourself, a legal entity with rights and responsibilities, and the freedom is dizzying. But freedom in the medieval world comes with an expiration date when you're female, and everyone is already calculating how long yours will last. Your husband's family wants the property back in their bloodline, or your own family wants to marry you off again, preferably to someone who will support them in their old age. The local Lord Steward has already visited, reminding you of the inheritance taxes you owe and mentioning, uncasually, that widows who remarry within his jurisdiction must pay a fee for the privilege, essentially a tax on your body and the property it controls. Everyone wants something from you, and the thing they want most is for you to stop being independent and return to being properly subordinate to male authority. Historians still argue whether medieval widows had genuine power or just the appearance of it, whether their brief autonomy was real freedom or just a gap in the control structure that society worked quickly to close. But you're living it right now, and the reality is complicated. Yes, you can make decisions, but every decision is scrutinized by men who have opinions about what you should do. Yes, you own property, but that ownership makes you vulnerable to pressure and schemes and elaborate plans to separate you from your assets. Yes, you're legally independent, but social pressure to remarry is immense, and remaining single requires resources and determination that not every widow possesses. Your husband's brother, William, his name is William, though you've barely spoken to him in the 5 years you were married to his younger brother. Documents across your table, their business papers, contracts and agreements, and he's explaining them in a tone that suggests he's being very patient with your female inability to understand complex matters. You actually understand perfectly well, having helped your husband with the accounts more often than William knows, but you let him talk because interrupting would only convince him you're being emotional and irrational, two qualities men always attribute to women who disagree with them. Here's something that might make you angry. The law in many medieval jurisdictions includes provisions for rightful male heirs to challenge a widow's inheritance, claiming that property should pass through the male line rather than pausing with a woman who might mismanage it or marry unwisely and transfer it outside the family. Your husband had no sons, no brothers except William, no clear male heir, which is why you inherited anything at all. But William is arguing that as the closest male relative, he should administer the estate for your protection, which is code for until I can figure out how to make it legally mine. You think about the widows you've known, trying to remember how their stories ended. Dame Alice, who inherited her husband's prosperous bakery and ran it successfully for 3 years before her stepson came of age and claimed it was rightfully his. She fought in court and lost, ending up with a small pension and a room in her daughter's house. Widow Margaret, who married again within 6 months of her husband's death, choosing a much younger man who everyone agreed married her for her property, which he proceeded to gamble away within a year. Old Joan, who never remarried, lived in increasing poverty for 2 decades, her inheritance slowly consumed by taxes and fees and the simple expense of survival, until she died in the charity hospital with nothing left but stories about when she was wealthy. The pressures to remarry are intense and come from every direction. Your family wants you married so you're no longer their financial responsibility. Your late husband's family wants you married to someone they approve of, someone who will maintain business relationships with them. The church reminds you that marriage is woman's natural state, that independence is unnatural, that you should be under male protection. Even friends suggest suitors, arrange introductions, hint that you're too young to remain alone, that loneliness will drive you mad, that you need a man to manage the things women can't possibly handle alone. But remarriage means surrendering everything you briefly possessed. The moment you marry again, all your property passes to your new husband, your house becomes his house, your money becomes his money. The brief window of autonomy closes with legal finality, and you become a wife again, which means becoming invisible again, legally subordinate again, your will subsumed into his. Some widows negotiate marriage contracts that protect portions of their property, but these require lawyers and leverage and a willingness to appear grasping and unfeminine, qualities that make you unmarriageable to the kind of men who might actually honour such agreements. You tell William that you need time to consider, that you're still grieving, that you can't make major decision about the estate while your mind is clouded with sorrow. He accepts this with visible impatience, reminding you that time costs money, that the business needs steady management, that your feminine grief is understandable but shouldn't interfere with practical matters. He'll return next week, he says, and perhaps by then you'll be thinking more clearly. The implication is obvious. Thinking clearly means agreeing with him, means surrendering control, means acknowledging that you're not really capable of managing what you briefly own. After he leaves, you sit at the table with the documents, trying to understand your options. You could sell the business, take the money, and live quietly somewhere. But women who control their own money are subject to schemes and frauds and men who befriend them only to manipulate them into bad investments. You could try to run the business yourself, but the guilds don't recognize female masters, and suppliers will question your orders, and customers will doubt your competence. And every small failure will be attributed to your sex rather than to normal business difficulties. You could remarry carefully, choosing someone who might treat you well and honour your wishes, but that's gambling your entire future on your ability to judge character. And medieval women who guess wrong end up with nothing. The wealthy widows fare better. You know this. Noble women with significant property can sometimes negotiate terms, can use their wealth as leverage to maintain some independence even in remarriage. Merchant widows in big cities have been known to run successful businesses for years, protected by guild memberships their husbands arranged before dying, and by sheer force of personality that makes it easier to work with them than against them. But you're not wealthy enough for real leverage, and not poor enough to be beneath their notice. You're in the dangerous middle, with enough property to be worth pursuing, but not enough to protect yourself from those pursuits. Do you remember learning about inheritance law as a girl? Probably not, because nobody bothers teaching women the legal structures that will control their entire lives. You learn to sew and cook and manage servants and keep accounts, all practical skills for wifehood, but nobody explained that you exist in a legal framework designed by men for men, where women are temporary placeholders at best, obstacles to proper property transfer at worst. You're learning now, though getting a crash course in medieval property law from the perspective of someone who's briefly escaped the usual categories but knows the escape is temporary. Tonight you lie awake in the bed you shared with your husband, and you're not thinking about grief, or at least not only about grief. You're thinking about money and property and the brief freedom that widowhood offers, and you're trying to calculate how long you can maintain independence before the pressure becomes unbearable, before you either remarry or surrender control to male relatives or slowly lose everything to taxes and fees and the general expense of existing without a man to navigate legal and business matters. Some widows manage it. You know they do, but most don't. Most eventually remarry or retreat into male-controlled households, or end their lives in poverty. The property they briefly held scattered to the winds, the autonomy they briefly experienced just a memory of something that was always temporary, always provisional, always subject to reclamation by the men who never really stopped believing it belonged to them. You're standing at a street vendor's stall, eyeing a roasted pork pie that smells divine, crispy pastry oozing with herbs and fat, and your stomach is growling because you skipped breakfast this morning. But you don't buy the pie, you can't buy the pie, not because you lack the coins, they're right there in your purse, enough for the pie and more, but because eating something this rich, this meat-heavy, this indulgent in public would mark you as a certain kind of woman, and that kind of woman is not respectable. So you move on to the bread seller, purchasing a plain wheat loaf that you can carry home and eat in private, where nobody will judge the speed of your chewing or speculate about your moral character based on your dietary choices. Food in the medieval world is never just sustenance. It's performance, communication, a visible demonstration of your social status and moral virtue that everyone around you is watching and judging with the intensity of food critics who believe your soul hangs in the balance. What you eat, where you eat it, how much you consume, whether you show obvious pleasure in the consumption, every aspect of your relationship with food sends messages about who you are and whether you're properly controlling your appetites. And appetite, as medieval thinkers never tired of reminding everyone, was directly connected to all other appetites, especially the sexual ones that women were supposedly unable to control without constant vigilance and social pressure. The rules are intricate and exhausting. Meat is for men and for the wealthy, substantial and strength-giving, appropriate for those who labour physically or govern politically. Women, especially common women like yourself, should subsist primarily on bread, pottage, vegetables, dairy products, lighter foods that don't inflame the passions or suggest greedy consumption. When you do eat meat, it should be in modest quantities, preferably at home, ideally prepared by your own hands, rather than purchased ready-made from vendors whose cooking might be suspiciously flavourful and therefore morally questionable. Eating in public is its own minefield of potential transgression. A woman sitting in a tavern eating a meal alone is assumed to be a prostitute looking for clients. Honest women eat at home or with family, not in commercial establishments where their presence suggests availability for transactions that go beyond the culinary. Even eating at market, standing at a vendor's stall to consume something you've just purchased, requires careful management. Small bites, mouth closed, no visible enjoyment, certainly no sounds of satisfaction that might suggest you're experiencing pleasure of any kind, because pleasure in food is uncomfortably close to other pleasures that respectable women aren't supposed to acknowledge. Historians still argue whether medieval food restrictions for women were more about health theories, the belief that women's colder or moister constitutions required slightly different diets than men's hot, dry bodies, or about social control, another way to regulate female bodies and appetites. But the practical effect is the same. You're hungry, the pie smells incredible, and you can't eat it without risking your reputation, so you don't. Here's something that might make you laugh bitterly. Medieval medical texts are full of warnings about what happens when women eat the wrong foods. Meat makes women lustful. apparently heating their naturally cold bodies and inflaming sexual desires that should remain dormant. Spicy foods have similar effects, which is why virtuous women avoid pepper and ginger and other exotic seasonings that might make their food taste like something other than boiled regret. Wine must be consumed sparingly, if at all, because drunk women lose their inhibitions, and inhibitions are apparently the only thing standing between respectable womanhood and immediate moral collapse. You think about the meals you prepare at home, how different they are from what you'd choose if choice were actually available. Your husband ate meat regularly, pork, mutton, the occasional chicken when finances allowed. You ate the vegetables cooked alongside the meat, soaking up some of the flavour but rarely consuming the flesh itself unless there were leftovers he didn't want. This wasn't explicit rationing. Nobody said the meat is not for you. It was just understood, one of those unspoken agreements that structures medieval life, that men need substantial food for their important work while women can make do with less, can survive on the scraps and sides and cheaper ingredients that stretch the household budget. Fasting is another complicated arena where food and female virtue intersect. The church mandates fasting days, Fridays, Lent games, various holy days scattered throughout the year, when everyone is supposed to abstain from meat and often from dairy products too, but women are expected to fast more rigorously, to take the church's requirements as minimum standards and exceed them with additional self-denial. Not eating becomes a form of piety, a way to demonstrate that you're more spiritual than physical, more soul than body, transcending the base needs that tie humans to earth and sin. Some holy women take this to extremes that everyone agrees are admirable but nobody actually wants their daughters to imitate. Saint Catherine of Siena reportedly ate almost nothing, surviving on the Eucharist wafer and occasional herbs, and her starvation was treated as miraculous proof of divine favour, rather than as what it obviously was, a young woman slowly killing herself while everyone applauded her spiritual devotion. The line between holy anorexia and concerning illness was never clearly drawn, but the message was clear enough. Women who ate less were more virtuous than women who ate normally, and the less you consumed, the more elevated your soul became. But you're not trying to become a saint. You're just trying to get through the day without collapsing from hunger, while also maintaining a reputation that won't get you accused of gluttony or sexual looseness or whatever other sins medieval society likes to project onto women who eat with visible enjoyment. You compromise constantly, eating enough to function, but not so much that anyone notices, consuming plain foods that don't suggest excessive appetite, declining treats and delicacies that might make you seem greedy or immodest. The wealthy women navigate these rules differently, their status buying them some flexibility that you don't possess. A noble woman at a feast can eat elaborate dishes because her consumption is part of demonstrating her family's wealth and status. She's a display piece as much as a participant, and her expensive, exotic foods advertise her husband's prosperity. But even wealthy women must eat delicately, taking small bites, leaving food on their plates to show they're not ruled by appetite, maintaining the fiction that they barely need sustenance at all, that they exist on some higher plane where physical hunger is beneath notice. You watch men at the market now, buying and eating with casual freedom that you envy more than you'd admit aloud. They purchase meat pies and eat them standing up, grease running down their chins, laughing with full mouths, eating seconds without anyone questioning their morals or virtue. A man with a healthy appetite is just a man. A woman with the same appetite is suspicious, her hunger suggesting other hungers, her visible enjoyment of food implying that she might enjoy other physical pleasures too. And from there it's a short leap to accusations of looseness and lack of proper control. The vendor you passed earlier is doing good business now, selling pie after pie to male customers who eat them immediately, standing in the street, clearly savouring every bite. You imagine what it would feel like to join them, to buy that pie and eat it right there, hot and delicious, without worrying about who might be watching or what conclusions they might draw. You imagine eating until you're satisfied, rather than eating just enough to quiet the hunger without satisfying it, which has become your normal relationship with food, an ongoing negotiation between physical need and social acceptability. Tonight you'll make pottage again, the eternal medieval stew of vegetables and grain and occasionally some scraps of meat if you're lucky. It's cheap, it's filling, it's the kind of food that nobody criticises because it's so obviously modest and practical and unexciting. You'll eat it without complaint because complaining about food suggests you think you deserve better, which suggests pride, which is a sin, which leads back to questions about your virtue and character. The pottage will be bland because interesting seasonings cost money and also might inflame your appetites. You'll eat enough to survive and not one bite more, because hunger is preferable to the risk of being seen as greedy, and being seen as greedy is just another way of being seen as uncontrolled. And being uncontrolled is the ultimate female failing in the medieval moral universe. The bread you purchased is heavy in your hands, a reminder of all the foods you wanted but didn't buy, all the appetites you're supposed to deny, all the pleasure you're meant to defer until some future moment that never actually arrives. Tomorrow you'll make the same calculations, choosing food based on reputation rather than hunger, eating in private what you'd never dare consume in public, maintaining the careful fiction that you barely need to eat at all, that you're so virtuous and controlled that physical sustenance is almost unnecessary. And you'll be hungry, always a little hungry, because hunger is apparently the natural state of respectable womanhood, a permanent condition that you're supposed to bear with grace and never complain about, because complaining would reveal appetites that respectable women aren't supposed to have. You're kneeling beside a neighbour's bed, pressing a cloth soaked in feverfew and willow bark against her burning forehead, murmuring the prayers your grandmother taught you alongside the herb lore. When the parish priest walks in and his face goes rigid with disapproval, he doesn't say anything immediately, just watches with narrowed eyes as you continue your work, checking the woman's pulse, noting the quality of her breathing, adjusting the poultices on her chest that you mixed from mustard and goose grease. You've done this 100 times, helped dozens of women through fevers and difficult births and mysterious ailments that physicians either can't or won't treat. But the priest's presence changes the atmosphere in the room, transforms your healing from charity into something potentially heretical, potentially dangerous, potentially punishable by accusations you'd rather not think about. Women have been healing each other since the beginning of human history, passing knowledge from grandmother to granddaughter, learning through experience and observation which herbs ease pain, which poultices draw out infection, which prayers seem to work alongside practical intervention. This knowledge is powerful and necessary. Physicians are expensive and rare, trained in universities that don't admit women, more likely to prescribe bleeding and mercury than anything actually helpful. For most medieval people, especially women, local healers are the only medical care available, but this also makes them threatening, their power outside official channels, their knowledge unregulated by church or university or guild, their success often perhaps better than that of trained physicians, which is precisely the problem. The word midwife comes from Old English meaning with woman, and it captures something essential about female healing. It's collaborative, relationship-based, passed through communities rather than taught in institutions. You learned your skills from your mother and her mother before her, from years of watching and helping and eventually doing it yourself under their supervision. You know which herbs grow where, which phases of the moon affect harvesting, which prayers to Saint Margaret protect women in childbirth. You can turn a breech baby, slow hemorrhaging with pressure and specific plants, recognize the signs of childbed fever early enough to sometimes prevent it. This knowledge has saved lives. You know it has. You've seen women recover who would have died without intervention. But the church is increasingly suspicious of female healers, especially those who work independently, rather than under male supervision. The official line is that healing should be done by trained physicians, all male, all university educated, all extensive, or by the church through prayer and intercession. Women who heal outside these approved channels might be using natural remedies, or they might be trafficking with demons. How can anyone tell the difference? Better to restrict healing to men who've been properly educated and ordained, who understand theology alongside medicine, who won't accidentally stumble into witchcraft while trying to cure a fever. Historians still argue whether the persecution of female healers was primarily about medical monopoly, physicians and apothecaries wanting to eliminate competition, or about controlling women who possessed power and knowledge outside patriarchal structures. But you're less interested in historical debate and more concerned with the priest who's still watching you with an expression that suggests he's mentally cataloguing your actions for future reference, possibly future accusation. Here's something that might make your blood boil. Male physicians routinely condemn female healers as ignorant, while simultaneously having worse outcomes. The university-trained doctor who visited this same woman yesterday prescribed bloodletting and recommended she drink mercury dissolved in wine, treatments that would have killed her faster than the fever. You gave her willow bark tea and kept her cool, simple interventions based on observation and experience, and she's already improving. But the doctor's dangerous incompetence is respected while your effective care is suspect, because he has credentials in Latin and a penis, which apparently matter more than whether patients actually survive. Midwifery occupies a particularly complex space in this landscape. Every community needs midwives. Childbirth is dangerous. Skilled attendance reduces maternal death. And male physicians generally refuse to involve themselves in women's bodies beyond abstract theoretical discussions. So midwives are tolerated, even sometimes licensed by local authorities or approved by the church. But they're also carefully monitored, required to report certain births, forbidden from using any remedies that might suggest magical intervention, always vulnerable to accusations if something goes wrong, or if someone powerful decides their knowledge has crossed the line from healing to witchcraft. You remember when your aunt was accused of causing a stillbirth through supernatural means. Even though the baby was clearly dead before labour began, you could tell from the cell, from the mother's fever, from a dozen signs that any experienced midwife would recognise. But the family wanted someone to blame, and accusing the midwife was easier than accepting that sometimes babies die and nobody's magic or medicine can prevent it. Your aunt was questioned. Her house searched for suspicious herbs or objects. Her reputation permanently damaged even though the accusation was eventually dropped for lack of evidence. She never practiced openly again, helping only family members and close friends, afraid that another accusation would lead somewhere darker. The licensing systems that exist are double-edged protections. Some towns require midwives to swear oaths before authorities, promising not to use magic, not to help women end pregnancies, not to conceal births of illegitimate children, to call a priest immediately if a baby seems unlikely to survive so it can be baptized. The license offers some legal protection, but also more surveillance, more rules, more ways to transgress and face consequences. And this church's approval always comes with strings attached. You must work within their framework, acknowledge their authority, submit to their oversight, Accept that your knowledge is only valid if they validate it. You finish tending your neighbour and gather your supplies, the remaining herbs, the cloths you'll wash and reuse, the clay pot that held the poultice. The priest finally speaks, asking where you learned your skills, whether you've been properly trained, whether you understand the spiritual dangers of meddling with illness that might be God's punishment for sin. You answer carefully, emphasizing the natural remedies, the prayers you always include, your respect for clerical authority and medical expertise. You're performing humility and orthodoxy, trying to convince him that you're helping rather than challenging, supporting the system rather than threatening it. The truth is more complicated. You do know things that male physicians don't. Remedies that work better than their expensive treatments. Techniques passed down through generations of female experience. You do operate outside official structures because those structures exclude you by design, because training costs money you don't have and requires Latin. You were never taught and assumes a male body capable of attending universities. Your knowledge is powerful precisely because it's practical, tested through centuries of trial and error, refined by the immediate feedback of whether patients live or die. But admitting this would be dangerous, would position you as a threat to medical and religious authority that neither will tolerate. The sick woman's daughter thanks you, pressing a few coins into your hand, payment for your time and skill. Though both of you pretend it's a gift rather than a fee, because charging for healing can be construed as selling something that should only be given freely through God's grace. The coins will help buy more herbs, replace supplies, maybe contribute to your own household expenses. You're not getting rich from healing work, just surviving while helping others survive. But even this modest exchange feels precarious under the priest's watching eyes. Tomorrow someone else will need help. A difficult birth, a child's cough that won't clear, an infected wound that's spreading red lines up an arm. You'll go because you have the knowledge and they need it, because women helping women is how your community survives, because letting people die when you might save them is its own kind of sin. But you'll go carefully, always aware that your healing could be reinterpreted as harming, that your cures could be called curses, that the thin line between respected healer and accused witch is determined not by what you actually do, but by how powerful men choose to interpret your actions. And you'll pray, genuinely pray, that your skills remain needed enough to be tolerated, but never successful enough to threaten the men who have decided that healing, like everything else, should ultimately be controlled by those who possess official credentials and approved authority, rather than by those who actually know what they're doing. You're standing in the drafty manor hall, waiting to give testimony about the disputed property line between your neighbour's field and the one your late husband farmed, and you've been standing here for 2 hours because the magistrate keeps hearing the male witnesses first even though you arrived earliest. When your turn finally comes, you step forward and begin to explain what you saw, where the boundary stones were placed, how long they've been there, the verbal agreement your husband made with the neighbour years ago. But before you're 3 sentences in, the magistrate holds up his hand and asks if there's a man who can corroborate your account. Your testimony alone, apparently, is insufficient, incomplete, legally questionable, despite the fact that you're the only person who was actually present for the conversation in question. Women's testimony in medieval courts occupies a strange twilight zone of partial validity, sometimes accepted but always worth less than equivalent statements from men, always requiring corroboration, always subject to dismissal based on assumptions about female unreliability that have nothing to do with actual truthfulness. The legal theory, inherited from Roman law and reinforced by church doctrine, holds that women are more prone to deception, more easily confused, more likely to be swayed by emotion rather than fact, and therefore their testimony must be weighted accordingly. One man's word equals two women's words, or three. Or in some jurisdictions, women's testimony isn't accepted at all, except in very specific circumstances involving other women where male witnesses would be inappropriate. The magistrate is looking at you expectantly, waiting for you to produce a male witness who can validate your observations, and you're scrambling mentally through possibilities. Your brother-in-law wasn't there, but he might be willing to say he heard your husband mention the boundary agreement. The neighbour's son might testify if you can convince him it's in his family's interest. Or you could simply give up, let the property dispute resolve itself without your input. Accept that your knowledge of the truth is legally irrelevant without male confirmation. Historians still argue whether women's restricted testimony rights were primarily about legal theory, genuine beliefs in female unreliability inherited from classical sources, or about practical power dynamics, ensuring that men controlled all official narratives and legal outcomes, but the effect is the same either way. Your voice in court matters less than a man's voice. Your observations carry less weight. Your oath is worth a fraction of an equivalent male oath. And this devaluation is baked into the legal system so thoroughly that challenging it would require dismantling the entire framework of medieval justice. Here's something that might make you want to scream. In cases involving rape or assault, women's testimony about their own experiences is routinely dismissed as unreliable, as possibly fabricated, as requiring extensive male corroboration before courts will even consider it. You must prove not just that the assault happened, but that you resisted sufficiently, that your reputation is spotless, that you reported it immediately to male authorities, that multiple trustworthy men believe your account despite not having witnessed it. The burden of proof rests entirely on the victim, and the proof required is often impossible to provide, which means most assaults go unpunished because women's voices aren't considered sufficiently trustworthy to establish facts about their own bodies. You think about cases you've heard of, stories that circulate among women in whispers because they're too disturbing to discuss openly. The merchant's wife who testified about her husband's business partner stealing from the accounts, her testimony dismissed despite her detailed knowledge because women don't understand finance, until the partner fled town with half the company's assets. The woman who witnessed a murder, whose clear account of what happened was weighted less heavily than a man who claimed to have seen something contradictory from much farther away, leading to the wrong person being convicted. The widow whose husband's will was contested by his brothers, her testimony about his spoken wishes dismissed as possibly confused or manipulated despite her having been present when he expressed them clearly. The few areas where women's testimony is accepted without male corroboration tell you everything about what medieval society considers appropriate female knowledge. You can testify about childbirth, about events that occurred in exclusively female spaces like birthing rooms or women's chambers. You can give evidence in cases involving other women's reputations, whether someone's a virgin, whether a widow is pregnant. These are the domains where female experience is considered valid. The intimate, quasi domestic, bodily matters that men don't want to deal with directly. Everything else requires male validation. Some women learn to navigate this system through strategic use of male proxies, finding men willing to testify on their behalf, cultivating relationships with brothers or sons or friendly neighbours who will speak their truths for them. It's frustrating and humiliating, having to channel your own knowledge through male voices to make it legally audible. But it's also pragmatic survival within a system designed to exclude direct female participation. You become skilled at coaching male witnesses, at explaining what they need to say, at hoping they remember your words accurately and deliver them with the confidence that apparently makes testimony credible. The magistrate is growing impatient with your silence, with your inability to immediately produce a male corroborator for facts you witnessed personally. You make a quick decision, telling him that your brother-in-law can confirm the boundary agreement, knowing you'll have to find him quickly and convince him to testify, hoping he'll agree and won't contradict your account or add confusing details. The magistrate nods, satisfied now that male testimony is forthcoming, and dismisses you to wait outside while he hears other cases. The legal theorists who write about testimony and evidence never seem to notice the obvious contradiction. If women are naturally deceptive and unreliable, why allow their testimony at all? If one man's word is worth two women's words, what's the mathematical basis for that particular ratio? How was it determined that female truthfulness is exactly half of male truthfulness? Why not 1/3 or 1/4? The arbitrary nature of these rules suggests they're not based on careful observation of actual reliability, but on the simpler principle that men make the laws and men benefit from laws that privilege male voices. You watch through the doorway as the magistrate hears case after case, noting how quickly he accepts male testimony, how rarely he asks men to corroborate their statements or produce additional witnesses. A man claims his neighbour's pig destroyed his garden, accepted without question. Another man disputes a debt, his word against another man's word, both given equal weight, the magistrate making a judgment based on which story seems more plausible. No women testify in any of these cases, even though you know for certain that several involve situations where women were present, where female witnesses exist but aren't called, because their testimony would require corroboration that the male parties can't or won't provide. The broader implications of restricted testimony rights extend beyond individual court cases. If women's voices don't count in legal settings, if their observations are presumed unreliable, if their accounts of events require male validation, then women effectively disappear from the official record of medieval life. History is written by those whose testimony is considered valid, whose voices are recorded and preserved and treated as factual. Women's experiences, women's knowledge, women's perspectives get filtered through male intermediaries or erased entirely, leaving a historical record that's partial, incomplete, systematically biased toward male perspectives and the male concerns. Your brother-in-law arrives, slightly confused about why you've summoned him but willing to help. You explain quickly what testimony is needed, coaching him on the details, hoping he'll remember and deliver them convincingly. He enters the hall, speaks confidently about boundary agreements and property lines, and the magistrate accepts his testimony immediately, nodding and making notes. The same information you tried to provide an hour ago is suddenly legally valid now that a man is delivering it. The dispute is resolved in minutes, the magistrate ruling in favour of your position, or rather, in favour of your brother-in-law's position. Since you've been erased from the official record of this case, your knowledge channeled through an acceptable male voice, afterward, walking home through streets that are growing dim with approaching evening. You feel the familiar mixture of relief and frustration, relief that the case was resolved favourably, that your knowledge ultimately mattered even if indirectly, frustration that it had to be translated through male speech to count, that your direct testimony was insufficient, that the legal system treats you as inherently untrustworthy, despite never having caught you in a lie, or found your previous statements unreliable. Do you remember being told as a girl that honesty was a virtue? Nobody mentioned that female honesty would be worth less than male honesty in every official context. That being truthful wouldn't matter as much as being male. Tomorrow someone else will need to testify about something they witnessed, and if that someone is female, she'll face the same obstacles you face today: the waiting, the skepticism, the requirement for male corroboration, the systematic devaluation of her voice, and she'll either find a man willing to speak for her or she'll remain silent, her knowledge legally irrelevant, her testimony uncounted, her voice one more in the chorus of women throughout medieval history whose truths were never quite true enough to matter without male validation. Your mother died yesterday morning, slipping away quietly after 3 days of laboured breathing, and now you're faced with the complex choreography of public mourning that will determine whether people remember her with respect or remember you as the daughter who grieved incorrectly. You're sitting in your house surrounded by neighbours who've come to pay respects, and you can feel their eyes on you, measuring your tears, evaluating your expressions, calculating whether you're displaying the right amount of sorrow, not too much, which suggests dangerous emotional instability, but not too little, which suggests cold-heartedness or secret guilt. Grief in the medieval world is never private, never purely emotional. It's a performance with strict rules, and failing to perform correctly can destroy your reputation as thoroughly as any actual crime. The ideal amount of grief for a woman exists in a narrow band between two equally condemned extremes. Too much sorrow, wailing, tearing your clothes, refusing food for days, collapsing in visible agony, marks you as hysterical, as someone who's lost control, as possibly possessed by dangerous emotions that might lead to madness or worse. Medieval medical theory held that excessive grief could actually kill women, whose weaker constitutions couldn't handle strong emotions the way men's could. But too little sorrow is equally problematic, suggesting you didn't love the deceased. Possibly that you're relieved by their death. Maybe that you had something to do with it. Every widow knows that insufficient grief after a husband's death invites speculation about poison and inheritance motives. You're aiming for the acceptable middle ground. Tears that flow but don't flood. Sadness that's visible but contained. Grief that demonstrates love without suggesting instability. It's exhausting, this constant monitoring of your own emotions, this performance of feeling that must be authentic enough to be believable but controlled enough to be respectable. You loved your mother. You're genuinely devastated by her loss, but you can't simply feel these things. You must display them correctly. Translate private anguish into publicly acceptable expressions that won't give neighbours material for gossip. Historians still argue whether medieval mourning restrictions were primarily about maintaining social order, preventing grief from disrupting community life, or about specifically controlling women, whose emotions were considered more dangerous and less governable than men's. But you're less concerned with historical debate than with the neighbour who's watching you with narrowed eyes, clearly taking mental notes about whether your grief meets her standards. Here's something that might make you laugh bitterly if you weren't so tired. Men can grieve however they want, or at least they have far more latitude in their expressions of sorrow. A man who weeps openly at his wife's funeral is considered tender-hearted and devoted. A man who remains stoic is praised for his strength. A man who drowns his grief in ale is just coping the best he can. The same behaviours in women are interpreted entirely differently. Tears become hysteria. Stoicism becomes cold-heartedness. Drinking becomes evidence of loose morals. It's remarkable how the same action changes meaning depending on which body performs it. The funeral customs vary by region and class, but they all share the common element of female grief being carefully regulated and observed. In some areas, professional mourners are hired for important funerals, women paid to wail and weep dramatically, performing the excessive grief that's inappropriate for actual family members, but somehow acceptable when it's theatrical and commodified. You watch these women sometimes, wondering what it's like to cry for strangers, to manufacture grief on demand, to perform the exact emotions that would damn you if they were genuine. Your mother's body lies in the next room, washed and wrapped by you and your aunts in a ritual that's one of the few exclusively female domains medieval society not only permits, but requires. Men don't prepare female bodies for burial. That intimacy is reserved for women. A recognition that some knowledge, some touch, some final care is appropriate only between those who share the same flesh. You and your aunts worked in near silence, washing away the traces of illness, combing her hair one final time, wrapping her in the linen shroud that you sewed yourself weeks ago when it became clear she wouldn't recover. That preparation was its own kind of grief, private and physical, the washing of your mother's body a final service and a farewell, but it doesn't count as official mourning because it happened in female space, without male witnesses. Its emotional content invisible to the community that will judge your grief based only on what you display publicly. The most genuine moments of your sorrow, the tears that fell while you washed her hands, the way you kissed her forehead before covering her face, those remain unseen and therefore uncounted in the social calculus of appropriate grief. The priest arrives for the funeral prayers, and the performance shifts into a new phase. You must weep but not disruptively, must participate in the prayers but not so enthusiastically that it seems performative, must accept condolences graciously without appearing to enjoy the attention. Other women who've buried mothers give you knowing looks, recognition of the impossible navigation you're currently attempting. They've been here. They've walked this same tightrope between too much and too little. They know that whatever you do, someone will criticize it. You think about Lady Catherine, the noble woman who buried her husband last year and made the mistake of remarrying within 6 months. The gossip was vicious. Clearly she'd never loved him. Clearly she'd been unfaithful during his lifetime. Clearly her grief was manufactured. Clearly she was only interested in keeping her property and finding a new man to warm her bed. Never mind that she had nursed him through 2 years of declining health, that she had been a devoted wife by every measurable standard, that remarrying was economically necessary and socially pressured. Her insufficient display of prolonged grief erased all of that, transformed her into a cautionary tale about women who don't mourn correctly. On the other extreme, you remember old Agnes, who mourned her husband so excessively that people began avoiding her, uncomfortable with her continued weeping years after his death. Her refusal to wear anything but black. Her transformation into a living monument to grief that made everyone around her uneasy. She was eventually whispered about as possibly mad. Her excessive grief interpreted as mental illness rather than profound love. Her dedication becoming a form of social transgression that marked her as someone who couldn't control her emotions, couldn't move forward, couldn't perform femininity correctly even in mourning. The funeral prayers conclude, and your mother's body is carried to the churchyard for burial. You walk behind the bier with the other women, and you're crying but not sobbing, showing sadness but maintaining dignity, hitting that narrow target of acceptable grief through sheer force of will and years of observing other women navigate this same impossible standard. At the graveside, you throw the first handful of earth, and the finality of the gesture breaks something in your careful control. Tears flow more freely. Your breath catches in something close to a sob. Immediately you feel your aunt's hand on your arm, a warning pressure that means, careful, you're close to the edge of acceptable display. You take a deep breath, force your face back into controlled sadness. Let the tears continue, but quietly, decorously, in the manner of a woman who's grieving appropriately rather than excessively. Your mother is going into the ground, and you can't even cry for her without monitoring yourself. Can't say goodbye without performing it correctly. Can't feel your feelings without translating them into socially acceptable expressions. Do you remember your mother teaching you about appropriate emotional display? She probably did, though you may not have recognized it as the instruction at the time. The way she controlled her own expression, the way she praised you for being composed, the way she gently criticized excessive emotion, all of this was training for moments like this, preparing you to navigate a world where even grief must be performed correctly or face consequences. After the burial, you return home to host the funeral meal, another performance with different rules. You must provide food, but not elaborate food. Too much suggests you're not truly grieving, that you're using the funeral as an excuse for socializing. You must converse with guests but stay somewhat subdued, friendly but not cheerful, engaged but not animated. You must accept their sympathy without seeming to seek it. Must appear grateful for their presence without appearing to enjoy the attention. Every moment is calculated, every accession monitored, every word weighed against potential misinterpretation. Tonight, alone, finally, you'll be able to grieve privately, without audience or judgment. You'll cry as much as you need to, loudly if that's what comes naturally. Or perhaps you won't cry at all because sometimes private grief is silent and numb. Either way, it won't count, won't be recorded, won't be the grief that people remember when they talk about how well you mourned your mother. That grief, the public performed, carefully calibrated grief is already being evaluated and discussed by neighbours who'll either approve or disapprove based on standards that shift depending on who's judging. Medieval women learn early that even their most private emotions must be made public and performed correctly. That feelings like grief and joy and anger exist in a social context that determines their acceptability based on display rather than authenticity. You're exhausted from the performance, drained by the constant monitoring of your own expressions, grieving both for your mother and for the simple human right to feel what you feel without it being judged, measured, and found either excessive or insufficient by people who weren't there when she took her last breath and won't be there tonight when you finally privately allow yourself to fall apart. You're standing at the edge of the village green where musicians have gathered for the harvest celebration, and your feet are tapping to the rhythm despite your best efforts to keep still. The music is infectious, a lively tune played on pipe and drum that makes your body want to move, want to spin, want to join the circle of dancers already forming in the torchlight. But you remain frozen at the periphery, because dancing without explicit permission from your husband, your father, or another male authority figure is another one of those invisible rules that can transform a moment of joy into evidence of moral failing. Movement itself becomes suspect when it's your body doing the moving, when female flesh responds to music without male authorization. Dancing in the medieval world is never just dancing. It's a complex social statement about control, propriety, sexuality, and obedience that changes meaning entirely depending on who's moving and under what circumstances. Men dance freely, their movements interpreted as celebration, as community participation, as healthy physical expression. Women dance under supervision, their movements carefully monitored for signs of excessive abandon, their participation requiring permission and often chaperonage, their bodies subject to interpretation that sees sensuality and sexual availability in movements that would be completely innocent if performed by male bodies. The village priest has opinions about dancing. He always has opinions about anything women enjoy, and he's expressed them frequently enough that everyone knows the acceptable boundaries. Communal dances at approved celebrations are permissible if women participate modestly, keeping their movements small and controlled, dancing primarily with other women or with male relatives. But spontaneous dancing, dancing alone, dancing with too much visible enthusiasm, dancing with men who aren't family, all of these shade quickly into behaviour that suggests loose morals and sexual availability. The same twirling movement that's charming when performed by a girl of 8 becomes scandalous when performed by a woman of 18. Your body's maturation transforming innocent motion into something sexualized regardless of your actual intentions. Historians still argue whether medieval prohibitions on female dancing were primarily religious, based on biblical warnings about dancing leading to sin, or social, another mechanism for controlling female bodies and ensuring women remained subordinate to male authority. But the distinction hardly matters when you're standing here wanting to dance and knowing that doing so without your husband's explicit approval could lead to gossip, accusation, and permanent damage to your carefully maintained reputation. Here's something that might make you want to laugh or scream. Medieval moralists wrote extensively about the dangers of dancing women, treating movement to music as if it were gateway behaviour to immediate prostitution. Dancing makes women heated, they claimed, inflames their naturally lustful nature, leads them to forget modesty and restraint. The hip movements, the spinning, the raised arms, all of it supposedly signals sexual availability and invites male attention that respectable women should be avoiding. Never mind that dancing is also joyful, communal, a form of celebration that humans have practiced in every culture throughout history. When women do it, it becomes dangerous. You watch the dancers now, trying to identify the acceptable patterns. The young unmarried girls dance together in a circle, their movements careful and controlled, chaperoned by older women who watch for any excessive enthusiasm or inappropriate gestures. The married women mostly stand at the edges, like you, occasionally venturing into sedate partner dances with their husbands, brief formal movements that barely qualify as dancing at all. The unmarried men leap and spin with abandon, their dancing athletic and enthusiastic, their movements praised as vigorous and healthy. The contrast is stark enough to make you angry if you let yourself feel it fully. Your husband is speaking with other men near the ale barrel, and you catch his eye, gesture toward the dancers, silently asking permission to join. He considers for a moment, then shakes his head, not angrily, just a casual denial that means he'd prefer you stay where you are, either because he doesn't trust you to dance modestly enough or because having his wife dance might reflect poorly on his status, might suggest he can't afford to keep you properly occupied at home, might imply something about your character that he'd rather not have implied. You nod acceptance, staying rooted at the periphery, watching others move while you remain still. The restriction on dancing connects to broader anxieties about female movement in general. Women are supposed to move carefully, sir, deliberately, with purpose and destination clearly defined. Walking quickly suggests urgency that respectable women shouldn't have. Running is completely inappropriate unless you're fleeing danger. Dancing movement for its own sake, for pleasure, without practical purpose, represents a kind of bodily autonomy that medieval society finds threatening in female bodies. If you can move spontaneously, joyfully, following music rather than male direction, what else might you do without permission? Some women circumvent the dancing restrictions through careful strategy. They wait until their husbands are sufficiently drunk to stop caring about their wives' activities, then join the dances while male attention is focused elsewhere. They dance only with female relatives, keeping movement small enough to claim they're barely dancing at all. They participate in ritualized dances at weddings and holy days where female dancing is not just permitted but expected. Using these sanctioned moments to move freely without facing criticism, it's exhausting. This constant calculation of when movement is acceptable. But it's also necessary survival within a system designed to restrict female bodily autonomy. You think about the stories of dancing women that circulate through your village. Cautionary tales meant to reinforce the restrictions. The merchant's daughter who danced too enthusiastically at a wedding and was thereafter considered fast. Her reputation damaged enough that her father had to accept a less advantageous marriage offer. The widow who joined a public dance without male escort and was accused of soliciting, of using dance as a form of sexual advertisement. The young wife who was seen dancing with a man who wasn't her husband and faced months of gossip suggesting infidelity. Her marriage strained by accusations based solely on shared movement to music. The music shifts to a slower tune, something melancholy and beautiful that makes your chest ache with wanting to move to it, to translate its sadness into motion, to express through dance what you can't express through words. But you remain still, your feet planted, your body disciplined into immobility despite every instinct crying out for movement. This is what medieval womanhood often feels like, wanting to move and being forced to stay still, wanting to express and being required to suppress, wanting to participate and being relegated to watching from the margins. Dancing also carries class distinctions that complicate the restriction. Noble ladies learn elaborate court dances, choreographed movements that are technically dance but so formal and structured that they barely seem like movement at all. These dances are acceptable because they're controlled, because every step is predetermined, because spontaneity has been trained out of them until they become moving etiquette rather than joyful expression. Common women like you don't have access to this kind of formalized dancing, so your options are either the simple communal dances at village celebrations, which you can only join with permission, or no dancing at all. The celebration continues around you. Music and movement and laughter that you're part of only as observer, not participant. Your feet have stopped tapping. Your body forced into stillness through sheer force of will and years of training in female immobility. Somewhere inside you there's a version of yourself that's dancing, spinning in the torchlight, moving freely without calculation or fear. But that version exists only in imagination, in the private space where you can still be fully yourself without social consequences. The public version, the visible version, stands still and watches, her movements controlled even in celebration, her joy expressed only through careful smiles and polite applause. Do you remember dancing as a child, before you understood that movement would become restricted, before your body became a site of surveillance and control? You probably ran and spun and jumped without thought, without monitoring yourself for excessive enthusiasm or inappropriate gestures. Growing into womanhood means growing into restriction, learning that your body is never quite yours to move freely, that even something as simple as dancing requires permission from men who may or may not grant it based on calculations that have nothing to do with your actual desire or joy. Later, walking home through dark streets with your husband, you hear music still drifting from the green, and your body responds instinctively, wanting to move to the rhythm. Your husband notices, smiles, and for a moment you think he might suggest you return or might give retroactive permission to join the dancing. Instead, he says, "I'm glad you didn't make a spectacle of yourself tonight," and you understand that your stillness was correct. Your immobility was virtuous. Your suppression of natural movement in response to music was exactly what he wanted. You've performed medieval femininity successfully once again, and the reward is his approval, his satisfaction with your obedience, his confidence that you're properly controlled and unlikely to embarrass him. Tomorrow there will be other celebrations, other moments when you'll want to move and be required to stay still, other songs that make your feet want to dance and your self-discipline forces into submission. This is just practice, just another in an endless series of small surrenders that accumulate over a lifetime until stillness becomes your default state, and you can barely remember what it felt like to move without asking permission first. You're hiding a book under your mattress, and the fear of discovery makes your hands shake as you push it deeper into the straw. It's not even a particularly scandalous book, just a collection of herbal remedies and household advice written in the vernacular. The kind of practical text that shouldn't threaten anyone. But it's yours, purchased secretly with money you saved from selling eggs, and the mere fact of you owning a book, of you reading independently without male supervision, makes it dangerous. Add to that the reality that certain books are explicitly forbidden to women, that possessing the wrong text can lead to accusations of heresy or worse, and your innocent household manual becomes evidence of transgression, proof that you're accessing knowledge meant to be filtered through male authority rather than consumed directly. Book ownership in the medieval world is complicated by multiple layers of restriction, cost, literacy, availability, and then, for women, the additional barrier of social prohibition against female intellectual independence. Books are expensive. Each one hand-copied by scribes who spend months producing a single volume, which means most people will never own one regardless of gender. But even when books become accessible, even when literacy spreads, women face unique restrictions on what they can read, who can know they're reading, and how they're permitted to interpret the text they encounter. The Church maintains lists of forbidden books, texts considered heretical or dangerous, and women are particularly warned away from these. The Bible in vernacular languages is suspect. Ordinary people reading scripture without clerical interpretation might develop incorrect ideas, might question official doctrine, might notice discrepancies between what the text says and what priests claim it means. For women to read the Bible independently is especially dangerous because female interpretation is presumed to be flawed, emotional rather than logical, likely to miss important theological points or misunderstand complex passages that require masculine reasoning to decode properly. Historians still argue whether restrictions on women's reading were primarily about controlling religious interpretation or about limiting female access to knowledge more broadly. But the effect is the same. Your book, hidden under your mattress, represents intellectual autonomy that medieval society finds threatening in female hands. Even practical texts become suspect when women read them independently. Because if you can read about herbal remedies without male guidance, what prevents you from reading theology, law, philosophy, texts that might give you ideas about your place in the social order and whether that place is justified or merely enforced? Here's something that might make your blood boil. Male scholars routinely read texts that would get women accused of heresy. They study classical pagan authors, debate theological controversies, access medical texts with explicit content, all while claiming that women's minds are too weak and prone to corruption to handle such material. The assumption is that men can read dangerous ideas without being damaged by them, can encounter heretical arguments without being converted, can study controversial texts purely for intellectual exercise. Women, by contrast, are presumed to be immediately corrupted by wrong ideas, unable to maintain critical distance, likely to be led astray by any text that challenges official orthodoxy or suggests women might be capable of more than their assigned roles. You think about the books you've heard exist but will never see. Philosophical treatises, legal commentaries, medical texts, histories written in Latin that you can't read anyway but wouldn't be allowed to access even if you could. The accumulated knowledge of centuries sits in monastery libraries and noble collections, and almost none of it is available to you, not because you lack intelligence or curiosity, but because you lack the right body, the right social position, the right official permission to declare yourself a scholar rather than just a woman with dangerous ideas. The few books that are acceptable for women reveal what medieval society believes female minds should contain. Books of hours, prayer books with beautiful illuminations and standardized devotions, are perfectly appropriate. They direct female piety along approved channels, require no interpretation, present no intellectual challenges. Saints' lives, especially those of female saints who died virgins or martyrs, model appropriate female behaviour and reinforce the message that suffering and obedience are women's highest virtues. Practical household guides are marginally acceptable, though even these can be suspect if they contain too much independent information or suggest that women might make decisions without consulting male authority. Romance literature occupies a complicated space, sometimes condemned as frivolous and likely to fill women's heads with unrealistic expectations, sometimes tolerated as harmless entertainment that keeps women occupied without threatening anything important. The tales of courtly love, of knights and ladies and impossible devotion, are both wildly popular and frequently criticized by moralists who worry that romantic stories might make real women dissatisfied with real marriages, might suggest that love and desire are legitimate considerations rather than dangerous distractions from proper wifely obedience. Your hidden book is technically legal, nothing explicitly forbidden, but its concealment tells the real story. You don't want your husband to know you own it, don't want him to know you're reading independently, learning things without his knowledge or permission. The book itself is less threatening than what it represents. Your intellectual life existing separately from his oversight. Your thoughts developing without his input. Your knowledge accumulating in spaces he can't monitor or control. This is the real danger of women reading. Not the specific content of any particular book, but the possibility of female minds operating autonomously, thinking thoughts that haven't been approved, reaching conclusions that might differ from official male interpretation. You've heard stories about women caught with forbidden books, and the consequences vary but are never good. A merchant's wife in the next town was discovered with a vernacular Bible and questioned extensively about where she got it, who gave it to her, what passages she'd read, how she'd interpreted them. The interrogation was more traumatic than any punishment. The assumption that she must have been corrupted by someone, must have been led astray. Because women don't seek out religious texts independently, they must have been manipulated into it. She eventually claimed her dead husband had owned the Bible, and she'd kept it for sentimental reasons without reading it. A lie everyone pretended to believe because it was easier than pursuing heresy charges against a widow with connections. The book burning you witnessed last year still gives you nightmares. The local priest had discovered a cache of texts he deemed dangerous, some actually heretical, some just in vernacular languages, some whose crime was never quite explained, and he made a public spectacle of destroying them, feeding them to flames while preaching about the dangers of unsupervised reading. The owner of the books fled town before he could be arrested, but his wife remained, questioned repeatedly about whether she'd read any of the forbidden texts, whether her husband had discussed them with her, whether she'd been contaminated by exposure to dangerous ideas. She insisted she was illiterate, had never touched the books, didn't even know what they contained. You have no idea if this was true or strategic, but it was smart. Claiming ignorance was her only defense against accusations of shared heresy. Your book remains hidden. Read only in stolen moments when you're alone, when no one might walk in and discover your secret literacy, your unauthorized learning. The knowledge it contains is mundane: how to make poultices for wounds, which herbs help with digestion, household management tips. But the act of reading it independently makes it dangerous. You're teaching yourself things without male mediation, developing knowledge outside official channels, thinking thoughts that no one else has approved or shaped. This is intellectual autonomy, and intellectual autonomy is precisely what medieval society works so hard to prevent in women. Do you remember the first time you realized that books were gendered, that certain texts were meant for men while others were acceptable for women, that the entire accumulated knowledge of human civilization had been sorted into categories of permitted and forbidden based on what medieval authorities believed female minds could safely contain? It probably wasn't a single moment of realization, but a gradual understanding, built from dozens of small lessons about what was appropriate for you to know, and what knowledge was reserved for male minds, supposedly better equipped to handle it without being corrupted or confused. The book under your mattress is thin, barely 60 pages, its knowledge limited and practical, but it's yours. You chose it, purchased it, read it without permission or oversight, and that makes it more precious than any text approved by male authorities and granted to you as appropriate female reading. Tomorrow you'll pull it out again when the house is empty. We'll study its pages and add to your store of knowledge that exists independently of male teaching. We'll continue building an intellectual life that exists in the shadows, unauthorized and therefore precious, forbidden and therefore carefully guarded. Medieval society wants women ignorant, or at least ignorant of anything beyond domestic duties and religious devotion. Your hidden book is a small rebellion against that enforced ignorance, a quiet insistence that your mind deserves feeding, that knowledge belongs to you as much as to any man, that books, even forbidden ones, especially forbidden ones, are treasures worth hiding under mattresses and reading by candlelight when no one is watching. You're standing at the edge of your village, looking down the road that leads to the next town, just 5 miles away, an easy walk on a good day, and you're calculating whether you can make the journey and return before anyone notices you're gone. Your sister lives there, recently married, and you haven't seen her in 6 months despite the short distance because travelling those 5 miles without male escort, without official permission, without a documented reason that some authority figure deems acceptable, transforms you from a respectable woman into something suspicious, something vagrant, something that requires explanation and justification. Distance from home means distance from reputation, and both journeys carry permanent consequences that no amount of innocent intention can erase. Medieval women exist in carefully defined geographic boundaries, their legitimate presence radiating outward from home in concentric circles of decreasing acceptability. Your house and its immediate surroundings, perfectly fine. You belong there. Your street, your neighbourhood, acceptable for daily errands and visiting close neighbours, the market and church, approved destinations with clear purposes. Beyond that, every additional mile requires justification, and the justification must be substantial enough to overcome the presumption that women who travel are either running away from something or running towards something inappropriate, either fleeing legitimate male authority or seeking illegitimate male attention. The road stretches before you, ordinary dirt and stones, the same road men travelled daily without anyone questioning their purpose or destination. Merchants move goods between towns, travelling for profit. Pilgrims journey to holy sites. Travelling for salvation, messengers carry letters and news. Travelling for employment, soldiers march to wars and travelling for duty. And you want to see your sister, to verify with your own eyes that she's settling into married life successfully, to share news and embrace and maintain the bond that geography now threatens. But wanting to see your sister, apparently, is insufficient justification for travelling 5 miles unescorted, and the insufficiency says everything about how medieval society values female relationships versus male oversight. Historians still argue whether travel restrictions on women were primarily about safety, genuinely protecting women from road dangers, or control, ensuring that female movement remained monitored and subordinate to male authority. But you're less interested in scholarly debate, and more focused on the practical reality that men travel and women don't, or at least women don't travel without permission, without escort, without explanation, without transforming themselves into suspicious figures whose very presence on the road requires justification. Here's something that might make you furious. The same journey that's forbidden to you alone is perfectly acceptable if a male relative accompanies you. Your husband could walk you to your sister's house and nobody would question it. Your father could take you, your brother could escort you. Even your adolescent nephew's presence would legitimize your travel in ways your adult female self alone cannot. The assumption is clear. Women unaccompanied by men are vulnerable, unprotected, and therefore either victims waiting to happen, or women deliberately making themselves available. And either way they're transgressing against proper feminine behaviour that requires constant male supervision. You think about the women you know who've attempted unauthorized travel, and their stories rarely end well. Your aunt left her village once without permission, fleeing an abusive husband. She made it 30 miles before being apprehended by local authorities who returned her home like escaped property. The law sided with her husband. Wives can't simply leave, can't decide independently that marriage has become unbearable, can't vote with their feet for better circumstances. She was beaten for leaving and watched more carefully afterward. Her brief attempt at geographical autonomy resulting in tighter restrictions than she'd faced before. The widow from 3 villages over who walked alone to the nearest city, seeking work after her husband's death left her destitute, was arrested as a vagrant and questioned about prostitution, because what other reason could a woman have for travelling alone? Her legitimate search for employment was interpreted as cover for sexual availability. Her poverty transformed from misfortune requiring sympathy into moral failing requiring punishment. She eventually found work, but only after being detained, questioned, and permanently marked as a woman of questionable character because she travelled without male escort or official permission. Pilgrimage offers one legitimate exception to travel restrictions, a holy purpose that sometimes overrides concerns about female mobility. Women can join pilgrim groups travelling to sacred sites, can journey hundreds of miles if the destination is sufficiently holy and the company sufficiently respectable. But even pilgrimage comes with caveats. Women should travel in groups, preferably with male relatives, definitely with other pilgrims who can vouch for their virtue. Solo female pilgrims are rare and regarded with suspicion, their piety questioned, their motives examined, their claims of religious devotion weighed against the transgressive fact of their independent travel. You've heard about Marjorie Kempe, the merchant's wife who travelled extensively on pilgrimage despite being married with children, who journeyed to Jerusalem and Rome and Santiago de Compostela, who moved through the medieval world with a freedom most women never experience. But you've also heard how she was constantly questioned, constantly accused, constantly required to defend herself against charges of abandoning her family, of making false claims to holiness, of using religious travel as cover for other darker purposes. Her extensive travels were documented. She dictated her autobiography, one of the first in English, but they were also contested, criticized, treated as evidence of either exceptional holiness or exceptional transgression, depending on who was interpreting her story. The road still stretches before you, and you've been standing here long enough that your indecision itself is becoming suspicious. A neighbour passes, gives you a curious look, and you make your decision. You'll stay home. You'll write a letter to your sister instead of visiting her. You'll maintain your reputation at the cost of the embrace you're longing for. The 5 miles might as well be 500, when travelling them alone would transform you from respectable woman into something questionable, something requiring explanation you can't adequately provide. Walking back to your house, you feel the weight of the invisible boundaries that contain you, the geographic limits that define your legitimate existence. Your world is small. A few streets, familiar faces, approved destinations, all within easy walking distance of home. Beyond these boundaries, you become suspect, your presence requiring justification that simply wanting to go somewhere is insufficient to provide. Men inhabit the larger world, move through geography with casual freedom, travel for business or pleasure or simple curiosity, without anyone questioning their right to be wherever they choose to be. You inhabit a smaller world, circumscribed by rules that treat female mobility as inherently suspicious, that assume women out of place are women up to no good. Do you remember learning these boundaries as a girl, figuring out through experience and correction how far you could wander before adult anxiety turned into adult prohibition? It probably wasn't taught explicitly, just absorbed gradually through observation and occasional sharp reprimands when you wandered too far, stayed away too long, appeared in places where young girls shouldn't be found. The lessons accumulated, building an internal map of permitted and forbidden geography that you carry with you always, that shapes your movements without conscious thought, that keeps you contained within acceptable boundaries most women never even think to question because they're so thoroughly internalized. Some women do travel, you know this. Noble women move between estates, their high status and inevitable entourages making their travel acceptable. Merchants' wives sometimes accompany husbands on business journeys, their presence legitimized by male companionship. Servants travel in service to employers, their movement justified by obligation rather than choice. But independent female travel, women moving through geography for their own purposes, following their own desires, seeking their own destinations, that remains rare, suspicious, requiring explanation, and often facing prohibition. Your sister's house is 5 miles away, and you won't see her today. Maybe next month your husband will agree to escort you. We'll have business in that direction, or time to spare for facilitating female relationships he considers less important than his own activities. Maybe your sister will visit you instead, though she faces the same restrictions, the same need for male permission and escort, the same transformation from respectable wife into questionable woman if she travels those 5 miles alone. Maybe you'll simply continue corresponding by letter, maintaining intimacy across a distance that's geographically trivial but socially unbridgeable without male mediation. The medieval world is vast for men and tiny for women, and the difference is entirely about power, about who's permitted to move freely and who must remain contained, about whose presence in any given place is presumed legitimate and whose requires constant justification. You walk back to your house, back to your acceptable geography, back to the small world that medieval society has decided is appropriate for female inhabitation. Tomorrow the road will still be there, still stretching toward your sister's village, and you'll still be here, still constrained by rules that treat female movement as transgression, still calculating whether any journey is worth the risk to your reputation, still living in the soul-bounded world that medieval womanhood requires. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that you watch from your doorway, and you're thinking about all the places you'll never see, all the journeys you'll never make, all the distances that remain forever out of reach, not because you lack the physical ability to travel them, but because you lack the male permission that transforms prohibited movement into legitimate travel. This is medieval womanhood too, staying still when you want to move, remaining local when you dream of distance, accepting geographic containment as the price of maintaining the reputation that's your only real possession, in a world that owns everything else about you. And so the rules settle around you like dust at day's end, invisible and everywhere, defining the borders of your life with invisible lines you've learned not to cross. You sit in the growing darkness, tired from a day of careful navigation, tired from years of monitoring yourself, tired from the constant vigilance required to be a medieval woman who survives with reputation intact. Outside your window, the world continues its turning, indifferent to the small boundaries that contain you, unconcerned with the codes you've broken or kept, unmoved by the price you pay daily for being born female in a time and place that treated womanhood itself as something requiring constant regulation and control. Tomorrow will bring more rules to navigate, more calculations about voice and clothing and movement, more performances of acceptable femininity that must be executed flawlessly or face consequences. But tonight, just for these quiet moments as darkness completes its claim on the sky, you can rest, you can let your shoulders drop, let your carefully maintained expressions relax into something more honest. Let yourself simply be without performing, without monitoring, without measuring every gesture against the invisible standards that judge you constantly. The medieval world made so many rules for women, built so many cages from custom and law and religious decree, created so many ways to transgress that simply existing became an endless negotiation between desire and danger. You've navigated them today, as you navigate them every day, and tomorrow you'll do it again, because this is what survival looks like when your body is regulated more heavily than any other resource, when your voice matters less than male voices, when your movement is restricted and your knowledge controlled and your grief measured, and your laughter monitored, and your very presence in the world requires constant justification. But you're still here, still yourself underneath all the performances, still thinking thoughts no one approved, still wanting things no one sanctioned, still human despite centuries of rules designed to make you less than that, designed to transform you into an object to be managed rather than a person with inherent worth and rights and dignity. Rest now. Let the story fade like torchlight dimming. Let the medieval world with all its restrictions retreat into the past where it belongs. You're safe here in the present, where women's voices can be loud, where you can wear what you choose, where you can walk alone at night, where your testimony counts and your laughter rings free, and your knowledge is yours to gather. The rules are gone now, dissolved into history, leaving only their echoes in the quiet parts of your mind where medieval women still whisper their stories, still share their strategies for survival, still insist against all evidence that they were human, they were worthy, they mattered, despite everything designed to convince them otherwise. Sleep well, you've earned it.